Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I never thought I'd be sharing this. Not even sure why I'm typing it out now, except that I can't stop thinking about it since our trip last month. Maybe writing this will help me process what happened. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I've been an avid backpacker for years. My wife Carla and I try to get out at least once a month during summer, and we often invite friends along. This time it was Rebecca, who we've known since college. She's relatively new to overnight hiking, but was eager to experience the backcountry. We picked a remote area near the Flint Creek Range in western Montana. It's not on many tourists' radars, which is exactly why we chose it. The trail wasn't particularly difficult, but it was isolated enough that we didn't expect to encounter other hikers. That was the point, to disconnect from civilization for a bit. We set out on June 28th. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, barely any bugs, and the wildflowers were in full bloom. The hike in took about 3 hours, following this beautiful little stream that eventually opened up to a small clearing that seemed perfect for camping. The spot was surrounded by dense pine forest on 3 sides, with the stream running along the 4th side. After reaching our camping spot around 4 in the afternoon, we quickly divided up the tasks. I set up Carla's tent while she filtered water from the stream. Rebecca, being the hammock enthusiast she's become, found 2 trees at the edge of our clearing to string up her hammock and tarp. I planned to do the same once I finished with Carla's setup. "This place is absolutely perfect," Rebecca kept saying as she secured her hammock. And it was. The clearing was just big enough for our small group, with soft, level ground and plenty of firewood nearby. The stream provided a constant, soothing background noise. No cell service, no other people, just the 3 of us and nature. I set up my hammock about 40 feet from Rebecca's, creating a rough triangle with Carla's tent. My spot was closest to the denser part of the forest. I remember joking that I'd be the first line of defense if any bears came snooping around. We all laughed at that. We spent the evening cooking dinner on our small camp stove, drinking tea, and catching up around a modest campfire. The conversation eventually turned to ghost stories and weird experiences, as it often does when you're sitting around a fire in the wilderness. Rebecca shared some story about her uncle's cabin and strange noises in the night. Carla talked about that time we thought someone was following us on a trail near Glacier National Park. Nothing serious, just the usual campfire talk. We turned in around 10. The temperature had dropped significantly, and we were all tired from the hike. I remember falling asleep almost immediately to the sound of the stream and the occasional hoot of an owl. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. My watch said it was 2:17 in the morning. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The forest was unusually quiet. Even the stream seemed muted somehow. I lay there in my hammock, listening, when suddenly there was a loud thump on my tarp directly above me. My first thought was that a pine cone or branch had fallen. But this didn't sound like that at all. It was more deliberate, like something had been placed there. I froze, straining my ears for any additional sounds. For what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard it, breathing. Not my own, which I was consciously trying to control, but something else. Something outside my tarp, standing very close to my hammock. I could hear deep, rhythmic breaths, much slower and deeper than a human's. I've had encounters with wildlife before. Deer investigating camp, raccoons searching for food, even a black bear once that wandered too close for comfort. This was different. Whatever was standing next to me was tall enough that its breath seemed to be coming from above my hammock, not at ground level. I lay completely still, afraid that any movement would provoke. Whatever it was, my heart was pounding so hard, I was certain it must be audible. The breathing continued for maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving away from my hammock toward the center of our camp. These weren't the scampering steps of a small animal or even the four-legged gait of a bear. These were bipedal footsteps, 2 feet, walking with a steady rhythm. The footfalls were heavy enough to slightly vibrate the ground, but controlled, not crashing through the underbrush like you'd expect from something large. I wanted desperately to peek out from under my tarp, but fear kept me paralyzed. The footsteps moved toward Rebecca's hammock, paused there, then continued toward Carla's tent. After another pause, they moved away from our camp entirely, back into the forest. Only when I couldn't hear anything anymore did I allow myself to breathe normally. I debated whether to get up and check on the others, but ultimately decided against it. What if it came back? What if it was still watching? I spent the rest of the night in a state of hypervigilance, drifting in and out of uneasy sleep. As dawn finally broke, I heard Carla emerge from her tent. I unzipped my tarp and climbed out of my hammock, feeling stiff and exhausted. Carla looked equally tired. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Her face immediately changed. "You heard it too?" Before I could respond, Rebecca joined us, looking pale. "Guys, something walked through our camp last night." We huddled around the fire pit, boiling water for coffee and comparing experiences. Carla described hearing heavy footsteps circling her tent around 2:30 in the morning. She said they stopped right next to her tent wall, and she could hear breathing on the other side of the thin fabric. "I was so scared I couldn't move," she said, her hands shaking slightly as she held her coffee mug. "And then there were these howls." "Howls?" I asked. "I hadn't heard any howling." "2 of them," she confirmed. "Not like a wolf or coyote. They started high and then broke into these short bursts. I've never heard anything like it." Rebecca nodded vigorously. "I heard those too. It was like..." She struggled to find the words. "Almost like a scream that turned into a stutter. Does that make sense?" It didn't. Not really. But I nodded anyway. "Something touched my tarp," I told them. It put something on top of it, then stood next to me, breathing. I could hear it moving between all our sleeping spots. We spent the morning searching for evidence. I'm not sure what we expected to find. Footprints maybe, or broken branches, but the ground around our camp was covered in pine needles and too dry to hold impressions. There was no sign that anything unusual had happened, but we all felt it. The forest seemed different somehow, as if we were being watched. None of us suggested extending our trip, and by unspoken agreement, we packed up immediately after breakfast. The hike out was tense and mostly silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were back in the car heading towards civilization that Rebecca spoke up. "Do you guys think it was a bear?" Carla and I exchanged glances. We'd both had enough wilderness experience to know this wasn't typical bear behavior. "Bears don't walk on 2 legs for extended periods," I said finally. "And they don't make those sounds you described." "Mountain lion?" Rebecca suggested, but her tone made it clear she didn't believe it either. "Whatever it was deliberate," Carla said quietly. "It checked each of us out specifically. It wasn't random animal movement." We fell silent again, the implications hanging in the air. I've spent weeks researching since then. I've looked into known wildlife in the Flint Creek area, listened to audio recordings of various animal calls, even reached out to local forest rangers with vague questions about unusual nocturnal wildlife. Nothing matches what we experienced. Nothing explains the bipedal movement, the deliberate investigation of our sleeping areas, or the strange howls that Carla and Rebecca described. I keep coming back to one conclusion, as reluctant as I am to admit it. I think a Sasquatch walked through our campsite that night. I think it stopped to examine each of us, perhaps curious about these strange humans sleeping in its territory, and then it disappeared back into the forest, leaving no trace except our shared experience. I've never been one to believe in cryptids or monsters. I'm still not sure I do, but I know what I heard, and I know what Carla and Rebecca heard. Something unusual visited us that night, something that moved on two legs, with a gait too controlled to be human, something large enough to make the ground vibrate slightly with each step, something that breathed with lungs larger than any human's. We haven't been camping since. Carla says she needs time to process what happened. Rebecca keeps sending me links to Bigfoot encounter stories, some of which describe experiences disturbingly similar to ours. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that night, but I know this. There's something out there in the Flint Creek Range that doesn't appear in any wildlife guide, something that walks upright, something that howls in a way no known animal does, something that's curious enough about humans to visit their camps in the dead of night. And honestly, I'm not sure I ever want to encounter it again. Story 2. I've debated for years whether to share this. Part of me wants to forget that day ever happened, but I can't shake it. Maybe writing it down will help. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. Honestly, I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived through it. This happened in November 2016. I'd taken a week off work for my annual hunting trip in Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. I've been bow hunting since I was 14, learned from my dad, and I've always preferred it to rifles. There's something about the challenge, the skill it requires. You have to get closer, be more patient, more aware of everything around you. That morning started like any other hunting day. I woke up at 4:30 in my camper, made some coffee, and got my gear together. It was cold as hell, maybe 28 degrees, but the forecast said it would warm up to the mid-40s by afternoon. Perfect hunting weather. I parked at a trailhead I'd used before, about an hour's drive from my campsite. I remember checking my watch as I started hiking in. It was 5:15, still pitch black. I used my headlamp on the lowest setting, just enough to see the trail. I didn't want to spook any deer that might be nearby. The spot I'd picked was about a mile in from the trailhead. I'd scouted it the previous day and found plenty of sign. Droppings, rubs on trees, tracks crossing a small creek. It looked promising. The spot overlooked a game trail along a ravine where deer would often travel between feeding and bedding areas. By 5:45, I was at my tree. I secured my bow and pack to my pull rope, climbed up, and hauled my gear up after me. My tree stand was about 15 feet up in a big maple, not super high, but high enough to keep my scent above most deer. I got settled in, nocked an arrow, and waited for the woods to wake up. Sunrise came around 7. The forest gradually brightened and birds started their morning songs. Chickadees, nuthatches, a distant woodpecker. I saw a couple of squirrels chasing each other, and a group of turkeys passed by about 70 yards down the slope, but no deer yet. That was fine. Patience is part of hunting. By 10 o'clock, I'd been in the stand for about 4 hours. My butt was getting numb despite my cushioned seat, but I was used to it. I'd eaten a granola bar and had some water from my bottle. The temperature had climbed to maybe 40 degrees. I was dressed in layers, thermal underwear, camo pants and jacket, a beanie and fingerless gloves that let me draw my bow if needed. That's when things started to get weird. I first noticed that the woods had gone quiet. I mean, completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. If you've spent time in the woods, you know that's not normal. There's always some background noise, wind in the trees, birds calling, something. But it was like someone had hit a mute button. At first, I thought maybe a coyote or a bear was moving through. That happens sometimes. Predators can silence the woods temporarily. I sat up straighter, alert, scanning the forest floor for movement. Nothing. The silence lasted for a good 20 minutes. I was just starting to think maybe it was nothing when I heard it. Heavy movement down the slope, toward the ravine. Not a deer. Too loud, too deliberate. My first thought was bear. Black bears are common enough in Pennsylvania, and they make a racket moving through underbrush. But what emerged from the thick rhododendrons about 40 yards away wasn't a bear. I'm still struggling to describe what I saw. It walked on two legs. Not like a bear occasionally does. This thing was fully bipedal, walking upright as naturally as a human, but it was massive. I'd guess 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Its body was thick, muscular, covered in dark brown hair, not fur like a bear, but hair, maybe 3 to 4 inches long all over its body. Its head sat low on its shoulders, almost like it didn't have a neck. The face was, I can't really describe it properly. It was partially covered in hair, but around the eyes, nose and mouth, the skin was visible. A grayish color. The eyes were deep set, dark, human-like, but not human. I froze. Completely. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I'd been hunting for 20 years and never seen anything remotely like this. My brain was struggling to process what I was looking at. Then it saw me. Our eyes locked, and I felt a chill run through my entire body. It knew I was there. It tilted its head slightly, like it was assessing me. Then it let out a sound I'll never forget. A deep, rumbling roar that seemed to echo through the entire forest. Not like a bear, not like anything I've ever heard. It was primal, terrifying. And then it charged toward my tree. I've never been so scared in my life. This thing covered the distance in seconds. I was 15 feet up, but that didn't seem nearly high enough. It reached the base of my tree and grabbed the trunk with its hands. Massive hands with thick, dark-skinned fingers and what looked like rough, horn-like nails. Not claws like a bear, but something different. The entire tree shook. My stand swayed, and I had to grab the safety rail to keep from falling. I thought the whole thing might come down. My bow clattered to the platform. My water bottle fell and hit the ground below. The creature stopped shaking the tree and looked up at me again. I could see its breath in the cold air. It let out another roar, even louder than the first. Then it began to circle the tree, never taking its eyes off me. It would stop, slap the trunk hard enough to make the entire tree vibrate, then continue circling. After a few circles, it backed up about 10 yards and just stared at me. I was trying desperately to control my breathing, to think of what to do. My phone was in my pocket, but there was no signal this deep in the forest. My bow was on the platform, but I knew an arrow wouldn't do much against whatever this was. And I wasn't confident I could even draw with how badly my hands were shaking. The standoff lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then the creature turned, walked to a fallen log about the size of my leg, picked it up like it weighed nothing, and hurled it at the base of my tree. The log shattered on impact. That's when I realized this thing could probably knock my tree down if it wanted to. For the next 2 hours, I checked my watch obsessively. The creature stayed nearby, sometimes circling, sometimes just standing still, watching me. Occasionally it would disappear into the underbrush, and I'd think maybe it was gone, but then I'd hear heavy breathing or a grunt from a different direction. It was like it was playing with me, keeping me trapped. I've never felt so helpless, so vulnerable. I kept thinking about my wife and kids, wondering if I'd see them again, wondering if anyone would ever find me or understand what happened. Around noon, the sounds began to fade. The creature seemed to be moving further away, down into the ravine. I stayed completely still for another 30 minutes, straining to hear any sign that it was still there. When I finally convinced myself it was gone, I had to figure out how to get down and get back to my vehicle. My legs were rubber from fear and from sitting in one position for so long. I lowered my bow and pack with my rope first, then slowly, as quietly as possible, climbed down, expecting at any moment for the creature to burst out of the brush. I grabbed my gear and practically ran back toward the trailhead, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every broken branch, every rustle in the leaves made me jump. I covered that mile in record time, gasping for breath by the time I reached my truck. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, locked the doors, and just sat there, shaking. Part of me wanted to report what I'd seen, but to who and what would I say? I saw Bigfoot. They'd think I was crazy or drunk. I drove back to my campsite, packed up everything and left. I couldn't stay another night. I drove 5 hours straight home, arriving late afternoon. My wife was surprised to see me back early. I told her I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't a lie. For weeks after, I had nightmares. I couldn't sleep without seeing those eyes, hearing that roar. I've never gone back to Allegheny National Forest. I've barely been hunting since. When I do go, I stick to open fields and farmland, places where I can see for hundreds of yards in every direction. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank. But I know what I saw. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the deliberate way it kept me trapped. No animal I know behaves like that, and no human could be that size or that powerful. I don't know what to call what I encountered that day. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it exists. And it's out there, and I hope to God I never see one again. I still have my tree stand. It's in my garage. Hasn't been used since. Sometimes I look at it and wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the fear, the absolute terror I felt. And I know it was real. I've never told anyone the full story until now. My wife knows something happened, but not what. How do you tell someone you saw a creature that's not supposed to exist? How do you make them understand the fear? So that's my story. Believe it or don't, like I said, I wouldn't if I hadn't lived it. But I know what I saw in those woods, and I know I'm never going back to find out if it's still there. Story 3. It was late August, one of those perfect South Dakota days when the heat starts to give way to fall. Me and 5 friends decided to have a barbecue at Beaver Creek. For those who don't know, it's this restored prairie area outside Sioux Falls with grassland stretching for miles, bordered by dense woods on one side and a small creek running through it. The place was beautiful during sunset, tall grass swaying in the breeze, wildflowers everywhere. We'd reserved one of the pavilions near the creek, nothing fancy, just a concrete slab with a metal roof, some picnic tables, and a built-in grill. Mike brought his famous marinated ribs, Jenny made her potato salad, and I supplied the beer. Dave and his wife Karen brought their 2 kids, who spent most of the evening catching frogs by the creek. My buddy Tom came too. He's an avid hunter who knows more about local wildlife than anyone I've ever met. The evening started off perfectly normal. We grilled, laughed, drank a few beers, and watched the sun start to set across the prairie. There were maybe 3 other groups in the park, but they were at pavilions pretty far from ours. It was around 8:30 when things changed. I was stoking the grill, trying to get one last batch of hot dogs cooked before it got too dark, when I noticed Tom staring intently across the creek. At first I thought he'd spotted a deer or something, but when I followed his gaze I didn't see anything except the tall grass and the tree line about 50 yards beyond. "What's up?" I asked him. He shook his head. "Thought I saw something move over there?" I didn't think much of it. The prairie was full of wildlife, deer, coyotes, all kinds of critters. But then Dave's kids came running back from the creek, both looking scared. "Daddy, there's something big in the bushes," his daughter said, pointing to the thick undergrowth on the other side of the creek. Dave laughed it off. "Probably just a deer, honey." But Tom wasn't laughing. He was still staring, his body tense in a way I'd never seen before. That's when we all heard it, violent rustling in the bushes across the creek. Not the kind of sound a rabbit or even a deer would make. This was something big, powerful, thrashing through the underbrush like it was nothing. "Everyone stay here," Tom said quietly, reaching for the flashlight he always carried. Before he could even turn it on, the rustling stopped. The sudden silence was worse somehow, like everything in the park was holding its breath. Even the crickets went quiet. Then came the growl. I've spent 40 years trying to figure out how to describe that sound. It wasn't like a bear or a mountain lion, and anyway, we don't have bears in that part of South Dakota. It was deep, guttural, and so powerful. I swear I felt it in my chest. It lasted for what must have been 15 seconds, though it felt like forever. It wasn't just loud. It was wrong, like nothing that should exist in our world. Jenny grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. Dave pulled his kids close. Karen started crying silently. "What the hell is that?" I whispered to Tom. He just shook his head, his face pale in the fading light. Nothing I've ever heard before. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. The ground actually trembled with each one. I'm not exaggerating. We could feel the vibrations through the concrete floor of the pavilion. Whatever was making those footsteps had to be massive. That's when we saw them. The trees at the edge of the woods starting to sway. Not from wind. Something was moving through them, something big enough to push aside trees that had to be 30 feet tall. "We need to leave. Now." Tom's voice was steady, but I could hear the fear in it. No one argued. Dave scooped up both his kids, one under each arm. Jenny abandoned her purse on the table. I left the grill burning. We just ran. As we sprinted toward the parking lot, I glanced back. The sun had nearly set, but there was still enough light to see something enormous and dark moving along the tree line. It was too far away and too shadowed to make out clearly, but whatever it was walking upright, and it was at least 8 feet tall. We weren't the only ones fleeing. The other groups in the park were running for their cars too. An older couple I hadn't even realized were there drove past us, the woman's face pressed against the passenger window, her eyes wide with terror. We piled into our 2 cars, me, Tom, and Jenny in mine, Dave, Karen, and the kids in theirs. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key in the ignition. As we pulled out of the parking lot, Tom rolled down his window and listened. The growl came again, closer this time, and now it sounded almost like words. Not English, not any language I'd ever heard, but structured with rises and falls like speech. We didn't stop until we reached my place in Sioux Falls. No one said much on the drive back. What was there to say? We'd all experienced something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. Over beers on my back porch, we tried to make sense of it. Dave suggested a bear, though he knew as well as anyone, there aren't bears in that area. Karen thought maybe it was some kind of prank, college kids with amplifiers and costumes. That was no prank, Tom said firmly, and it wasn't a bear or a moose or a damn elk. I've hunted everything in this state and 3 states over. Never heard anything make a sound like that. Could it have been multiple animals? Jenny suggested. Maybe a territorial dispute or something? Tom just shook his head. Those footsteps belonged to one creature. One very, very large creature. We eventually agreed to keep the incident to ourselves. Who would believe us? What would we even say? That we'd been chased out of Beaver Creek Park by some kind of monster? The next morning I called Steve, a friend who worked as a park ranger in the area. I tried to sound casual, asking if there had been any unusual animal sightings around Beaver Creek lately. There was a long pause before he answered. "Why do you ask?" His voice was careful, measured. I mentioned we'd heard some strange noises while barbecuing, nothing more. Another long pause. "Look, Rick," he finally said, "I wouldn't normally share this, but since we go way back, I saw something out there last October. Full moon night, I was doing a final patrol before closing the park. Saw 3 massive black figures moving through the prairie grass about a quarter-mile out." My blood went cold. "What do you mean by figures?" "Upright, walking on 2 legs. At first, I thought maybe it was cult members or something. You know how we get those weirdos sometimes? Looked like they were wearing robes with pointed heads, but the way they moved, too fluid, too fast. And they were huge, Rick. Tallest one had to be 9 feet at least." "Did you report it?" He laughed bitterly. To who? My supervisor. He'd have me take a drug test and mandatory leave. So no, I didn't report it, but I started carrying my sidearm on all patrols after that, even though regulations say to leave it locked up. After I hung up, I started digging through old newspapers at the library. Turned out there had been a lot of strange reports in the area during that time. The Argus leader had run several stories about UFO sightings and strange lights in the sky around Sioux Falls in 78 and 79. One farmer claimed something had killed 3 of his cattle and removed organs with surgical precision. A trucker reported being followed by a dark figure along Highway 42 for several miles before it veered off into the prairie. I went back to Beaver Creek once, about a month later, in broad daylight. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that whatever we'd heard that night probably had a logical explanation, but I couldn't make myself cross the creek. Standing there looking at those woods, I felt watched. The hair on my arm stood up, and I swear the temperature dropped 10 degrees, even though it was a warm September day. I noticed something else too. The usual wildlife sounds were missing. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The whole area felt wrong, like nature itself was avoiding it. I've spent decades trying to convince myself it was just a bear passing through, or maybe wolves, though they weren't common in the area then. But deep down, I know better. Whatever we encountered that night wasn't something science has a name for. Tom moved to Oregon a few years later. Before he left, he confessed he'd gone hunting near Beaver Creek after our experience. Carrying a rifle loaded with the heaviest rounds he could find, he never saw anything, but he told me he'd found footprints in a muddy section near the creek, over 16 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toes. He didn't take pictures, said he didn't want proof, just wanted to know he wasn't crazy. Dave and Karen never talked about it again, at least not with me. Their daughter had nightmares for months afterward. Jenny told me once, years later after a few too many drinks, that she sometimes still wakes up hearing that growl. As for me, I've learned to live with the uncertainty, but I don't go hiking anymore. I don't camp. And whenever I hear about Bigfoot sightings or strange creatures in the woods, I don't scoff like I used to, because I know there are things out there in the dark, things that shouldn't exist but do, things that watch and wait, just beyond the trees, just out of sight. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right across the prairie at night, I swear I can still hear that growl, that deep, chest-rattling sound that wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human, and will haunt me until the day I die. Story 4. I've been sitting on this story for almost 40 years, and I still don't have a good explanation for what happened. It was the summer of 1984. I was a 5th grader at Lake Ellen Camp near Crystal Falls in Dickinson County, Michigan. Looking back now, that place was incredibly isolated. Nothing but dense woods and swampy areas for miles around. Perfect for something to hide in, I guess. Me and my 2 friends, Brian and Kyle, were typical 11-year-old boys at summer camp, always looking for adventure and usually finding trouble instead. It was a hot July day, and we were exploring one of the 2-track paths that ran behind the cabins. The main camp activities had finished for the afternoon, and we had about an hour of free time before dinner. We were just walking along, throwing rocks and talking about whatever 5th grade boys talked about back then, when Brian suddenly stopped and pointed at the ground. "What the heck is that?" he asked. I remember the exact feeling in my stomach when I looked down. There in the soft dirt of the path was a footprint, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. It was huge, way bigger than any of our feet and crazy wide. But the weirdest part, it only had 3 toes. 3 distinct, massive toe impressions. "Somebody's messing with us," Kyle said immediately. That was the logical explanation. Some counselor had made fake footprints to scare us kids, but then we noticed there were more prints, about 7 of them in sequence, perfectly preserved in the slightly damp soil. They continued down the path, each one spaced really far apart. I was about 5'6" back then, tall for my age, and even when I tried to match the stride by running and jumping between prints, I could barely do it. We followed the tracks for a while, trying to figure out what made them. The strangest part was how clear they were. You could see the three-toed impression perfectly, like whatever made them had put its full weight into each step. "It's just some older kids playing a joke," Brian insisted, but he didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. The prints were too perfect, too consistent. And why only 3 toes? If you were going to fake monster tracks, wouldn't you make something more normal? We spent about 20 minutes examining those tracks before we had to head back for dinner. The whole time we ate, we talked about what we'd found. A couple of the other kids at our table laughed it off, said we were making it up. Our counselor Mike just smiled and told us it was probably deer tracks distorted by mud. But I knew what deer tracks looked like. These weren't deer tracks. After dinner, we had a campfire, and then some free time before lights out at 10 o'clock. That's when things got weird. Brian and I decided to play a prank on Cabin 4, classic camp stuff. We were going to knock on their door and run away. Kyle chickened out and went back to our cabin, so it was just the two of us. The camp was pretty dark by then, with just a few lights around the main buildings. Most of the illumination came from the moon, which was nearly full that night. We snuck over to Cabin 4, knocked hard 3 times, and then ran to hide behind this big pine tree about 30 feet away. We were trying not to laugh as we heard someone inside the cabin grumbling and coming to the door. That's when we heard it, a low, deep growl coming from the woods behind us, from the direction of that 2-track path where we'd found the footprints. It wasn't a dog or a wolf. I'd heard those before. This was deeper, more guttural, and it had this weird resonance to it that made the hair on my arms stand up. Brian and I froze. We didn't even look at each other. We just stood there, barely breathing. The growl came again, closer this time. I'll never forget the way Brian's face looked in the moonlight. His eyes were wide, and he was pale as a ghost. I'm sure I looked the same. "Let's go," I whispered. And we didn't even wait to see who opened the cabin door. We just bolted back to our own cabin and dove inside. Our counselor asked what was wrong, and Brian mumbled something about hearing a weird animal in the woods. Mike laughed it off, told us it was probably just a raccoon or something, but he hadn't heard it. He didn't know. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I was lying in my bunk, listening to the sounds of 9 other boys snoring and shifting in their sleep. The cabin was hot and stuffy, and my mind kept going back to those tracks and that sound. It must have been around midnight when I heard it. A scream, not just any scream. It sounded like a woman, but it wasn't hysterical or panicked. It was a clear, almost deliberate scream that echoed through the trees. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding. The sound came from the same direction as the growl earlier, the same area where we'd found those tracks. The thing is, Lake Ellen was an all-boys camp. The only women there were a couple of cooks and the preacher's wife, and they all stayed in quarters near the main building, nowhere near where that sound came from. I wanted to wake someone up, to have someone else hear it too. But before I could, the sound came again. That same clear, eerie scream, and then silence. I barely slept that night. I kept waiting for something to happen, for whatever made that sound to come to our cabin. Nothing did. But those hours lying awake were some of the longest of my life. The next morning, it rained heavily, a summer thunderstorm that rolled in before dawn and didn't let up until after breakfast. Brian, Kyle, and I immediately went back to check on the tracks as soon as we could, but the rain had washed them away completely. The path was just a muddy mess with puddles everywhere. There was no evidence left of what we'd seen. We told a couple of counselors about the tracks and the sounds, but they just smiled and nodded in that way adults do when they think kids are exaggerating. One of them suggested it might have been a bear, but bears don't have 3-toed feet, and they don't scream like women. For the rest of that camp session, nothing else happened. No more strange tracks, no more growls or screams in the night. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the woods. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line during outdoor activities. I went back to Lake Ellen Camp every summer until I was 16, partly because I enjoyed it, but mostly because I wanted to find proof of what we'd seen. I never did. No more tracks, no more strange sounds. Sometimes I'd walk that same two-track path alone, hoping and dreading at the same time that I might find something. I've spent a lot of time over the years trying to rationalize what happened that day. Maybe the tracks were just human footprints expanded by mud, like one counselor suggested. But that doesn't explain why they only had 3 toes, or why they were spaced so far apart, and it certainly doesn't explain those sounds we heard. I've read about Bigfoot sightings in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Some reports mention unusual vocalizations that sound like women screaming. Some even describe 3-toed tracks, though that's less common in the literature. I'm not saying that's what we encountered, but I can't rule it out either. The rational part of my brain tells me there must be a logical explanation. Maybe some older campers playing an elaborate prank. Maybe a combination of natural phenomena that, to 3 imaginative kids, seemed supernatural. But the part of me that was there, that saw those tracks with my own eyes and heard those sounds with my own ears, that part knows something strange happened at Lake Ellen Camp in the summer of 1984. I'm 49 years old now, with kids of my own. I've never told them this story because I don't want them to think their dad is crazy. But sometimes when we're camping and they hear a strange sound in the woods, I see the same look on their faces that must have been on mine all those years ago, and I tell them it's just the wind, or an animal, or their imagination. But a part of me wonders if it's something else. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan is still largely untamed, with vast stretches of forest where people rarely go. Is it so hard to believe that something could live there, undetected, something that leaves 3-toed prints and screams in the night? I don't know. But I do know what I saw and heard that summer, and no amount of rational explanation has ever fully satisfied me. Those tracks were real. Those sounds were real. And sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm half asleep, I can still hear that scream echoing through the trees, and I wonder what might have happened if we'd ventured back into those woods after dark. Whatever it was, it left no traces except in the memories of 3 fifth-grade boys. The rain washed away the physical evidence, and time has blurred some of the details. But I still remember the essential facts. 3-toed tracks, impossibly wide, with a stride no human could match. A deep growl that seemed to vibrate in my chest, and that scream, clear, deliberate, and utterly inhuman, cutting through the Michigan night. I've never gone back to Lake Ellen as an adult. Part of me wants to see if I can find any traces of whatever we encountered. But another part is afraid. Not of finding something, but of finding nothing. Of confirming that it was all just the overactive imagination of a 5th-grade boy, because deep down, I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that something was there with us in those woods, something that science can't easily explain. Story 5. I've held this in for over a decade now, and I need to finally write it down. I'm not someone who believes in monsters or makes up stories for attention. Before July 2013, I would have laughed if someone told me they saw a Bigfoot. Now I don't laugh anymore. I was working a soul-crushing office job back then and desperately needed to disconnect. I'd been planning this solo hiking trip in the Bitterroot Mountains for months, mapping routes, researching trails, the whole deal. Western Montana has some of the most remote wilderness left in the lower 48, and that's exactly what I wanted, to get away from people and reset my brain. I took a Friday off work to make it a long weekend and drove out early Thursday morning. The trailhead was already pretty isolated, and I didn't see another car in the small gravel lot when I arrived. Perfect. I double-checked my pack, locked the car, and hit the trail around 9 in the morning. The weather was ideal. Clear blue skies, about 75 degrees, with a light breeze. The trail started through dense pine forest before gradually climbing higher. I'd planned to camp near this ridge about 10 miles, in that supposedly had amazing views of the valley. According to my map, there was a small clearing that would be perfect for setting up camp. The first few hours were exactly what I needed. Just me, the sound of my boots on the trail, birds calling, and occasional rustling in the underbrush from small animals. I stopped a few times to take photos and eat some trail mix, but mostly kept a steady pace. By early afternoon, I'd made good progress and was getting into the more remote sections of the trail. Around 2 or 3 o'clock, the trail narrowed significantly as it curved around this steep, rocky slope. It was barely wide enough for one person, with a sheer rock face on one side and a pretty significant drop on the other. Not quite a cliff, but steep enough that you wouldn't want to slip. The trail had been ascending gradually, and I was getting a bit winded. So when I came across a small rocky ledge that jutted out over the valley, I decided to take a proper break. I set my pack down, pulled out my water bottle, and sat on this flat rock, enjoying the view. The ledge was maybe 15 feet wide and 10 feet deep, with the mountain face behind me and the trail continuing around the bend. Below me was a stunning view of the valley with dense forest stretching for miles. I remember thinking how small I felt in that vast wilderness. I'd been sitting there for maybe 10 minutes when I heard something that didn't fit. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I recognized it as movement, heavy movement on the trail behind me. My first thought was that another hiker had caught up to me, which was surprising since I hadn't seen anyone else all day. I stood up to look back down the trail, and that's when I saw it. About 30 feet away, where the trail curved around the mountain, was a dark shape. My brain tried to process what I was seeing, trying to fit it into categories I understood. Bear, moose, another hiker wearing a dark jacket. But it wasn't any of those things. It was standing upright on 2 legs. But this wasn't a person. It was massive. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing had to be at least 8 feet, maybe more. Its shoulders were incredibly wide, and its arms hung down past its knees. The body was covered in dark brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like long matted hair that moved slightly in the breeze. The face is what really froze me in place. It wasn't covered in the same thick hair as the body. Instead, it had darker, rougher-looking skin. The head was rounded and seemed to sit directly on the shoulders without much of a neck. I couldn't make out detailed facial features from that distance, but I could see its eyes watching me. I realize now I must have stood there, staring for several seconds, completely paralyzed with shock. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The creature took a few slow, deliberate steps toward me on the narrow trail. Its movement was smooth but heavy. I could hear each footfall on the packed dirt. Then it stopped, maybe 20 feet away now, and just stared at me. I could hear its breathing, deep, heavy breaths that seemed too loud for the quiet mountain air. That's when reality hit me like a truck. I was trapped. Behind me was the rock face of the mountain. To my left was the steep drop. The only way out was the trail, and this thing was blocking it. I remember my legs starting to shake. My mouth went completely dry. I had a small pocket knife, but it felt absurdly inadequate. What could I possibly do against something this size? Running wasn't an option. Fighting wasn't an option. I was completely at its mercy, and we both knew it. The creature took a few more steps forward, and I involuntarily backed up until I felt the rock wall against my back. It stopped again, maybe 12 or 15 feet away now. I could see it more clearly, the way its chest expanded with each breath, the powerful muscles moving beneath that matted hair. Its hands were massive, with long fingers and what looked like darkened nails or claws. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It crouched down and placed one hand on a boulder at the edge of the trail. like it was preparing to climb up toward me. In this position, I could see its face better, a wide mouth with large, flat teeth, visible behind thick, cracked lips. Its nose was broad and flat against its face, and its eyes. I still have nightmares about those eyes. They weren't animal eyes, but they weren't human either. There was intelligence there, calculation. I was certain this was it. This thing was going to kill me, and no one would ever know what happened. They'd find my car at the trailhead eventually, organize a search party, but they'd never find my body. Or maybe they would, weeks later, with evidence of an animal attack. The creature made a sound then, not a growl exactly, more like a loud, sharp bark that seemed to vibrate the very ledge beneath my feet. It was a warning sound, powerful enough that I physically felt it in my chest. I thought it was the precursor to an attack, but then something unexpected happened. The creature turned away. It just turned away. Without any apparent reason, it moved off the trail and into the thick brush, pushing aside small trees like they were nothing. It didn't look back. It just left. I remained frozen in place for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. I was afraid to move, afraid it might still be watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. Eventually, the crushing silence became too much, and I knew I had to move before I lost daylight. With shaking hands, I grabbed my pack and started back down the trail, away from my planned destination and back toward my car. I moved as quickly as I dared on the narrow path, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow looked like that creature. I hiked until I found a spot near a creek that seemed somewhat safer, more open, with better visibility and the sound of running water that might mask my presence. I set up my tent but didn't sleep a wink that night. I just sat there with my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, listening to every sound in the woods. At first light, I packed up and practically ran the remaining miles back to my car. I've never been so happy to see a parking lot in my life. It's been over 10 years now, and I've told this story to exactly 3 people. 2 thought I was making it up, or had seen a bear standing on its hind legs. The 3rd person listened quietly, and then told me about a similar experience they'd had in the Olympic Peninsula. I don't know what I saw that day. I can't explain why it didn't attack me when it clearly could have. That thing could have easily climbed up to where I was. It was clearly built for that terrain in ways humans aren't, but it chose to leave me alone. I've read books about Bigfoot encounters since then, trying to make sense of what happened. Some theories suggest they're territorial, but not necessarily aggressive unless threatened. Maybe it was just warning me that I was in its territory. Maybe something else caught its attention. I'll never know. What I do know is that I haven't been hiking alone since that day. I haven't returned to the Bitterroots. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that bark-like warning sound in my dreams. The memory of those eyes watching me remains crystal clear, while other details of my life from that time have faded. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just telling you what happened to me on that mountain ledge in July of 2013. There are things in those remote forests that most people will never see, and maybe that's for the best. Story 6. I've been sitting on this experience for months now, unsure if I should even share it. I'm not the type who believes in monsters or reads cryptid stories for fun. I'm a professional photographer. I deal in reality, in what I can see through my lens. But what happened to me last October in the Sam Houston National Forest has completely altered how I see the world. I was on assignment for Texas Highways magazine, capturing the autumn landscapes of East Texas. I've done dozens of these shoots over the years, and they're usually the highlight of my job, getting paid to hike through beautiful wilderness areas and photograph them. It doesn't get much better. That day started like any other assignment. I packed my Canon 5D Mark IV, 3 different lenses, tripod, water, snacks, and my usual gear. The weather was perfect, around 70 degrees with scattered clouds creating interesting shadows on the landscape. I was excited to get some shots with the late afternoon light filtering through the pines. I parked my state vehicle, a white Ford Explorer with the Texas Parks and Wildlife logo, on this little-used access road about 20 miles from the nearest ranger station. The editors wanted pristine wilderness shots, not the heavily trafficked areas near the campgrounds. I'd researched some potential locations and found this spot that looked promising on satellite images. It had a clearing created for power lines that would give me both forest edge shots and some open vista opportunities. I loaded up my backpack, locked the car, and started hiking. It wasn't a marked trail, just me following my GPS and instincts. The forest was peaceful, pine needles cushioning my footsteps, birds calling overhead, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Nothing unusual. I've spent enough time in these forests to feel comfortable off-trail, though I always stay aware of my surroundings and keep my bearings. After hiking about 1.5 miles, I reached the clearing I'd spotted on the maps. It was perfect, a long, straight cut through the forest for power lines, maybe 50 yards wide, with the afternoon sun angling in beautifully. The foliage was just starting to change colors, with splashes of red and gold among the green. I set up my tripod near the tree line and started shooting. I'd been there maybe 45 minutes, moving along the edge of the clearing to capture different angles, when I noticed a small black bear about 100 yards away. It was at the opposite tree line, partially visible, nosing around some fallen logs. I was thrilled. Wildlife shots always make editors happy, and black bears aren't common sightings in this part of Texas. I slowly mounted my telephoto lens, trying not to make sudden movements. The bear was oblivious to me, and I managed to get a few decent shots from a safe distance. I was about to try moving slightly closer when something strange happened. The bear suddenly froze. Its head snapped up, ears alert, nose testing the air. Then it bolted, not casually ambling away like bears often do when startled, but full-on panicked running, crashing through the underbrush like its life depended on it. It disappeared into the forest in seconds. Something about that reaction sent a chill through me. Bears don't typically run like that unless they're genuinely threatened. I scanned the clearing but saw nothing that would cause that reaction. No other animals, no people, just the empty power line cut, the forest edge, and the late afternoon shadows stretching across the ground. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. 20 years of wilderness photography has taught me to trust that feeling. I quickly collapsed my tripod, shoved it and my camera into my backpack, and turned to head back the way I came. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards into the forest, partially concealed by vegetation but unmistakably there, was a figure. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as a person, maybe a hunter or another hiker. But within seconds I realized what I was seeing wasn't human. It was enormous, taller than any man I've ever seen, 7 feet at minimum, possibly closer to 8, and the proportions were all wrong. It stood upright but had no visible neck, just broad shoulders that seemed to connect directly to what I can only describe as a domed head. The coloring was dark, a deep brown or black that blended with the shadows. I couldn't make out facial features from that distance, thank God, but what I could see was its arms. They hung unnaturally low, much longer than a human's would be. The whole thing was covered in what looked like hair or fur, not patchy like a mangy bear standing on its hind legs, but a uniform covering. I stood completely frozen. My camera bag felt impossibly heavy on my shoulder. My mouth went dry, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Time seemed to stretch and distort. The thing didn't move at first. It just stood there, partially hidden by a cluster of pines. I had the horrifying sense it was watching me, assessing me. I remember thinking irrationally that I wished I had my camera ready, not to capture proof, but because somehow having that barrier between us would make this less real. Then it shifted position, just slightly, but enough that one hairy arm came fully into view. The movement was fluid, deliberate. This wasn't an animal reacting on instinct. There was intelligence behind that movement, a calculated decision being made. In one violent motion, it reached down, grabbed what I later realized was a small tree trunk, deadfall that had been lying on the forest floor, and hurled it in my direction. I can't emphasize enough how unnatural this was. This wasn't a bear swatting at something. This wasn't a person throwing a stick. This was a massive being deliberately picking up what must have been a 15-foot-long trunk, several inches thick, and launching it like a spear. The projectile flew through the air and landed with a sickening thud about 10 feet to my right, embedding itself partially in the soft ground. If it had hit me, I would have been killed instantly. That broke my paralysis. I turned and ran. I'm not in bad shape. I hike regularly for my job, but I've never moved like I did that day. Pure adrenaline and terror propelled me through the forest. I didn't follow the careful path I'd taken in. I just ran in the general direction of my vehicle, crashing through underbrush, jumping over fallen logs, my camera gear banging painfully against my back. Low-hanging branches whipped across my face. Thorns tore at my arms and legs. I slipped on pine needles and fell hard at one point, scraping my palms and knees. But I was up again in seconds. The worst part was not knowing if it was following me. I couldn't hear anything over my own ragged breathing and the sound of my boots pounding the forest floor. Every few seconds, I'd risk a glance over my shoulder, terrified I'd see that massive form gaining on me. But the forest behind me remained empty, or at least, it appeared that way. I reached my vehicle in what felt like both an eternity and no time at all. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. I threw my gear in the passenger seat, started the engine, and peeled out, the tires spinning on the dirt road before finding purchase. I drove way too fast on that narrow access road, bouncing violently over ruts and potholes, certain that at any moment that thing would emerge from the trees and block my path. It wasn't until I reached the main forest road that I finally allowed myself to slow down and take a full breath. My clothes were soaked with sweat. My arms and face were scratched and bleeding from the branches I'd run through. My camera equipment, thousands of dollars worth, was probably damaged from the rough treatment, but I was alive. I drove straight to the nearest gas station, went into the bathroom, and was physically sick. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself, wild-eyed, pale, with small cuts across my cheeks and forehead from the branches. I didn't report the incident. What would I say? That I saw Bigfoot? That some unknown forest monster tried to kill me with a tree? I'd either be labeled a prankster or a lunatic, and honestly, I wasn't sure what I'd seen. The rational part of my brain kept trying to categorize it. A bear, a very tall person in dark clothing, a shadow and foliage creating an optical illusion. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what I felt. The palpable malevolence, the intelligence behind those movements, the deliberate nature of the attack. I completed my assignment for the magazine over the next few days, but I stayed on well-traveled paths near ranger stations. I'd pull over, take some quick landscape shots, and get back in my vehicle. The editors were confused about the lack of deep wilderness shots they'd requested, but I made up some excuse about equipment issues. It's been 4 months, and I still haven't been back to that part of the forest. I've turned down 2 assignments that would have taken me to similar remote areas. My wife thinks I had some kind of panic attack in the woods and is pushing me to see someone about it. Maybe she's right. Maybe there's a perfectly rational explanation for what happened. But rational explanations don't throw tree trunks like javelins. Rational explanations don't make bears flee in terror. I've spent my career capturing the beauty of wild places. I've always felt at home in the wilderness. But now, whenever I look at the edge of a forest, I can't help but wonder what might be looking back. I can't shake the feeling that I glimpsed something that day that wasn't supposed to be seen. Something that's been there all along, watching from the shadows while we convince ourselves we're alone in the woods. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. I just know that something unexplainable lives in the Sam Houston National Forest, and it knows I saw it. Story 7. I've been debating whether to share this for years now. Most people I've told think I'm crazy, or that I was seeing things. But I know what I saw that day in Kisatchie National Forest, and it wasn't anything that should exist in this world. This happened back in early November 2011. I'd been hunting in Kisatchie for years. It was my go-to spot during hog season. My buddy Jake usually came with me, but he'd thrown his back out the weekend before, so I ended up going solo. Probably the biggest mistake of my life. I'd been tracking this group of wild hogs for a couple days. Found some fresh rooting and droppings near this small clearing, about 4 miles in from the main access road. Real remote spot. The kind of place where your cell phone is just dead weight in your pocket. I got there way before sunrise, maybe around 4:30 in the morning. It was cold as hell that day. That damp Louisiana cold that cuts right through your clothes. I remember the sky was clear though, with a half moon providing just enough light to set up my ground blind without using my headlamp too much. I wanted to minimize any human scent or presence. The blind was nothing fancy, just a pop-up tent with some mesh windows and woodland camo pattern. I positioned it downwind from where I expected the hogs to enter the clearing, based on the tracks I'd found the day before. I had my Remington 308 with me, a good thermos of coffee, and some beef jerky to keep me going through the morning. Once I was set up, the waiting game began. Anyone who hunts knows this part. The hours of sitting completely still, trying not to make a sound while your ass goes numb and your legs start to cramp. The forest woke up slowly around me, first the owls going quiet, then the early birds starting to chirp as the sky began lightening from black to deep blue. By sunrise, I'd already been sitting motionless for almost 3 hours. My back was killing me, but I didn't dare shift positions too much. Wild hogs have terrible eyesight, but their sense of smell and hearing is incredible. One wrong move, and they'd be gone. Around 10 in the morning, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, I finally saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A good-sized boar, probably around 150 pounds, cautiously stepped out from the tree line. He was a dark one, with those curved tusks that can gut you open if you're not careful. I'd been waiting for this moment. Very slowly I raised my rifle, trying not to make a single sound, as I lined up the shot through my scope. The crosshairs were right on the sweet spot behind his shoulder. My finger was just starting to apply pressure to the trigger when something happened that I still can't fully explain. There was this massive crash from the trees behind the boar, like someone had pushed over a small tree. The hog instantly froze. His ears perked up and his whole body went rigid. I kept my scope on him, thinking maybe another hunter was in the area and had spooked the game. That's when it happened. Something, and I mean something, burst from the woods with a speed that didn't make sense for its size. It was massive, covered in this dark reddish-brown hair, and it tackled that boar from the side like a linebacker. The hog didn't even have time to run. It got knocked clean off its feet with this high-pitched squeal that made my skin crawl. I instinctively pulled back from my scope to get a wider view, and I swear to God, what I saw was standing upright. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. This thing was kneeling over the boar now, and I could see its hands, not paws, but actual hands with fingers, holding down the struggling animal. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was terrified that if I made even the slightest sound, that thing would notice me. So I just sat there, watching through the mesh of my blind, as this creature pinned down a 150-pound wild boar like it was nothing. The boar was fighting hard, thrashing and squealing, but this thing just held it down with these incredibly powerful arms. The muscles on its shoulders and back were rippling under all that hair. Then, in one swift motion, it grabbed the boar by the neck and slammed it against the ground. The crack that followed was loud enough that I heard it clearly from my position. The boar went completely limp. I'll never forget what happened next. This creature, this thing, seemed to examine its kill. It tilted its head, looking at the dead hog in this eerily intelligent way. Then it grabbed one of the boar's hind legs and started dragging it toward the trees. It wasn't struggling at all, just pulling this heavy animal like it weighed nothing. As it turned to leave, I got a better look at it. The hair wasn't uniform. It was tangled and matted in places, with patches of what looked like dark, leathery skin visible near the shoulders. But it was the face that haunts me. It had this sloped forehead and heavy brow, almost like a gorilla, but different. Its mouth was wider, and I could see yellowish teeth as it breathed through its mouth. The eyes were deep-set, dark. There was intelligence there. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than a minute or two, but it felt like hours. When the creature finally disappeared into the woods, dragging its kill, I still couldn't move. I just sat there trembling, my rifle forgotten in my hands. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. I kept thinking I must have seen a bear, but I knew it wasn't. Bears don't stand and move like that. They don't have hands that can grab things with such precision. I don't know how long I stayed frozen in that blind. Maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Eventually, I knew I had to get out of there. I packed up my gear as quietly as possible, keeping my rifle ready the whole time. The walk back to my truck was the most terrifying experience of my life. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that thing was following me. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made my heart stop. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and got the hell out of there. I was shaking so bad, I could barely get the key in the ignition. The whole drive home, I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind, trying to convince myself it was just a bear or maybe another hunter in some kind of ghillie suit. But I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those powerful arms, those hands, that face. I got up and started researching online. That's when I first really looked into Sasquatch sightings. The descriptions matched what I'd seen. The height, the reddish-brown hair, the strength, the way it moved, everything lined up. The next day, I called Jake and told him what happened. He thought I was pulling his leg at first, then suggested maybe I'd seen a black bear. But bears don't stand over 6 feet tall on their hind legs and drag 150-pound hogs through the woods without effort. They don't have hands with fingers that can grab a hog's neck. I considered reporting it to the local wildlife department, but what was I going to say? That I saw Bigfoot kill a wild boar? They'd think I was crazy or drunk or both, so I kept it to myself, only telling a few close friends who mostly humored me, but clearly didn't believe me. A week later, I went back to that same spot in Kisatchie with Jake. I had to show him, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. We found the clearing easily enough, but there was no sign of what had happened. No blood, no tracks that couldn't be explained by normal wildlife. Jake pointed out that wild hogs can root up the ground pretty good, erasing any evidence. But I know what I saw. It's been over a decade now, and I still hunt. But never alone, and never in that part of Kisatchie. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it. There have been reports of strange sounds and sightings in that forest over the years, but nothing as clear as what I witnessed. I know how this sounds. I know most people reading this will think I'm making it up, or that I saw a bear and my mind played tricks on me. But I know what I saw. It wasn't human. It wasn't any animal that's supposed to exist in those woods. It was something else entirely. That thing could have killed that wild boar with its bare hands, a wild boar that could seriously injure or kill a person. And it did it with such ease, such practiced skill, like it had done it hundreds of times before. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, seeing those dark eyes and powerful hands in my mind. The most terrifying part? That creature is still out there somewhere, and now I know what they're capable of. The scariest thing about my experience isn't just that these creatures exist. It's that they're intelligent predators with incredible strength who've managed to stay hidden despite countless people venturing into their territory. That day in Kisatchie, I wasn't the hunter. I was potential prey that got lucky enough not to be noticed. I still go hunting. I still enjoy the outdoors, but I'm a lot more careful now about where I go, and I never, ever hunt alone anymore. Because once you've seen something like that, something that shouldn't exist but absolutely does, you never feel completely safe in the woods again. Story 8. I never thought I'd be posting this. To be honest, I've debated for weeks about whether to share what's been happening at our home. I'm not the type who believes in the paranormal or monsters in the woods. I'm a practical person. I've had to be. Being a single mom for the past 15 years teaches you to deal with reality, not fantasies. We live in a modest ranch house on about 2 acres of land, roughly 20 minutes outside of town. It's nothing fancy, but it's ours. The property backs up against a pretty dense section of forest with lots of underbrush. It's always been peaceful here, until about 3 months ago. It started in mid-September. My son Tyler, he's 12, came to breakfast looking tired. When I asked if he'd slept okay, he just shrugged and said, "Something was looking in my window last night." I didn't think much of it at first. Kids have nightmares, right? But Tyler isn't the imaginative type. He's always been straightforward, almost surprisingly practical for his age. He gets that from me, I guess. "What do you mean, something?" I asked. "I don't know. It was big. Its face was pressed against the glass." That's when my stomach first dropped. Tyler's bedroom is on the side of the house, and his window sits about 5 feet off the ground. Whatever he saw would have had to be tall, very tall, to look in. He described it as dark, with no real color he could make out. But he said it had a broad face and eyes that seemed to reflect the little bit of light from our yard. I asked if it could have been a deer or some other animal, but he just gave me that look kids give when adults aren't getting it. Mom, it was looking at me. Like really looking at me. I went outside that morning to check under his window. The grass was flattened in a spot and some weeds were bent over, but there weren't any clear footprints I could see. I told myself it was probably just deer, or maybe a bear, though we rarely see bears this close to the house. But then it happened again 3 nights later, and then twice the following week. Sometimes we'd go 5 or 6 days with nothing, then it would show up several nights in a row. Tyler started keeping his blinds closed, but he said he could still sense when it was there. He'd wake up with that feeling of being watched, and sure enough, the next morning I'd find evidence that something had been standing outside. By early October, I installed a motion-activated light on that side of the house. It started triggering almost every night between 2 and 3 in the morning. Each time I'd look out my window. My bedroom is on the opposite side of the house, but by the time I got there, whatever had triggered it was gone. In the mornings, I'd find those same strange impressions in the grass, always in the same spot. Like something had stood there repeatedly. Sometimes I could make out what looked like heel marks, but never a complete footprint. One night in mid-October, I was doing laundry around 11:30. Tyler had been asleep for a couple of hours. Our laundry room has a small window that faces the same side of the house as Tyler's room. I was folding clothes when I heard it, a low grunt or heavy breath from the backyard near my son's window. It wasn't a deer snort or any animal sound I recognized. My heart was pounding as I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. I shined it out the window toward the sound. That's when I saw it, or at least part of it. Something large moved from near Tyler's window into the bush at the edge of the trees. It was dark, but I could tell it moved upright. Whatever it was, it wasn't scared off by my light. After that night, we started keeping all blinds and curtains closed after dark. Tyler moved his bed to the far wall, away from the window. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That something tall was looking in our windows, with no evidence other than flattened grass. They'd probably think I was crazy. November is when things really intensified. I started finding strange structures near the edge of our property. Sticks arranged in teepee shapes or leaned against trees in ways that couldn't have happened naturally. They looked deliberately placed. I also discovered flattened areas in the underbrush that resembled bedding spots, like something large had been lying there. The smell started around then too. It's hard to describe, but imagine a skunk and wet dog combined with something else I can't quite identify. It's musky and strong, and once you smell it, you don't forget it. The first time I caught a whiff of it was when I was hanging clothes on the line. It was so powerful I actually gagged. I bought 3 different trail cameras, thinking I'd finally get proof of whatever was visiting us. I set them up around the property, focusing on the areas where I'd found the stick structures and near Tyler's window. Every single one of them failed. The batteries would drain within a day, no matter what kind I used or where I mounted them. Brand new batteries, completely dead by morning. I've never had that happen before. Things got quiet for a while in December. Almost 2 weeks with no incidents. I started to hope maybe whatever it was had moved on. Tyler was sleeping better. I was sleeping better. Then one night, Tyler came into my room around 1 in the morning. "It's back," he whispered. "I can feel it." I grabbed my robe and the baseball bat I'd started keeping by my bed. We went to the living room, which has a large window facing the side yard. I didn't turn on any lights inside. I didn't want to scare it off before I could see it. The motion light hadn't triggered yet. We stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring into the darkness. Then Tyler grabbed my arm and pointed. About 10 feet from the house, just beyond where the porch light could reach, was a tall, still shape. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there. I couldn't make out details, but whatever it was had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was broader at the shoulders than any person I've ever seen. I fumbled for the light switch and flipped on the outside floodlights. By the time my eyes adjusted, it was gone. But it hadn't run away. It's like it just melted into the darkness at the edge of our property. The next morning, I found 2 partial footprints in a muddy section of the yard. One was just a heel and arch, but the other showed most of a foot. It was huge, easily 15 inches long and proportionally wide. I tried making a plaster cast like I'd seen on those Bigfoot shows, but it cracked when I tried to remove it. I still have the pieces, though. The toes were distinct. 5 of them, like a human foot, but not human at all. Since then, the activity has been sporadic. Sometimes we'll go a week or more with nothing, then have 3 or 4 nights in a row where the motion lights trigger and Tyler wakes up with that feeling of being watched. I've found more of those stick structures, always in different places. Twice, I've heard wood knocks at night, 3 distinct knocks, then silence. The strangest part is that it seems focused on Tyler. It never approaches my window, never seems interested in me at all, just my son. I don't think it's trying to hurt him. It's had plenty of chances if that was its goal. It seems more curious, but that doesn't make it any less terrifying. I've considered moving, but this is our home. We can't afford to just pick up and leave, and I refuse to be driven away by fear. Instead, I've started documenting everything, taking photos of the footprints and stick structures, keeping a journal of when the visits happen and what we experience. I've even left out food a few times, fruit and nuts, which disappears overnight. I've done enough research now to be convinced we're dealing with what people call a Bigfoot. I know how that sounds. 3 months ago, I would have laughed at anyone who suggested such a thing, but when you've seen what I've seen, when your practical, no-nonsense son tells you night after night that something inhuman is watching him, well, you start to question what you believe. Last week, I was taking out the trash at dusk when I caught movement at the tree line. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out details, but something large was standing there, partially hidden by a tree. I raised my hand slowly, not waving, just acknowledging its presence. It didn't move for several seconds. Then it stepped back and was gone. I don't know why it's here or what it wants with us, with Tyler. All I know is that something is out there, something that stands in the same spot night after night, looking in at my son while he sleeps. I keep the baseball bat by my bed. I've started recording the sounds at night. Sometimes, when I play back the recordings, I can hear heavy breathing that wasn't audible at the time. The most recent incident was just 3 nights ago. The motion light went on around 2:30 in the morning. Instead of looking out the window, I grabbed my phone and started recording through the blinds. On the video, you can just make out a large, dark shape moving slowly across our yard. It stops at Tyler's window, and though the quality is poor, you can tell it's looking in. It stands there for almost a minute, then turns and walks, not runs, walks, back to the tree line. I still haven't told anyone except you all. Who would believe me? But I know what we're experiencing is real. Whatever this creature is, it's become a part of our lives now. I just wish I knew what it wanted with my son. Story 9. I still don't know what to make of what happened that night, and I'm honestly still freaked out just thinking about it. This happened back in October of 2016, when I was still taking night classes at the community college in Simcoe. I was 22 at the time, and living with my parents to save money while finishing school. It was a Tuesday night, and my environmental science class had just let out around 9:30. It was one of those chilly October nights where you can see your breath in the air. The sky was clear with a half moon, and there was that distinct fall smell, like decaying leaves and wood smoke. I remember being pretty tired because I'd been up since 6 that morning for my part-time job at the local hardware store. I always took this shortcut home through the back roads near Delhi to save about 15 minutes on my commute. It's all farmland out there, cornfields that had already been harvested, some soybean fields, and patches of dense woods scattered between the farms. The roads are narrow, just 2 lanes with no shoulder, and there are these old wooden utility poles running alongside them. During the day, it's peaceful and pretty, but at night, with just my headlights cutting through the darkness, it always felt a bit eerie. I had my radio on low, some classic rock station, and was just thinking about the assignment that was due the following week when I rounded this bend in the road. My high beams were on, since there wasn't any other traffic, and that's when I first saw it, something standing next to one of the utility poles about 300 meters ahead. My first thought was that someone's car had broken down, and they were waiting for help. It seemed like a strange place to be at that hour, but I didn't think much of it. I did what any driver would do. I dimmed my high beams as I approached, not wanting to blind the person. But as I got closer, maybe 200 meters away, something felt off. The proportions weren't right. Whatever was standing there was tall, really tall, and it wasn't moving like a person would. You know how people shift their weight from foot to foot when they're standing around? This thing was completely still, almost unnaturally so. I slowed down a bit, partly out of curiosity, and partly because something in my gut was telling me this wasn't normal. As the distance closed to about 100 meters, I could make out more details, and that's when I realized I wasn't looking at a human being. This thing was massive. It was standing upright next to the utility pole, and its shoulders were broader than any person I've ever seen. It had its back mostly toward me, facing the woods on the other side of the road. The pole had a crossbar where the wires connect. You know those horizontal pieces about 15 or 16 feet up? This thing's head was higher than that crossbar. I felt my mouth go dry, and my heart started pounding in my chest. I was still driving toward it, but now I was gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I couldn't turn around on that narrow road, and there was nowhere to pull off. The only option was to keep going. At about 100 feet away, my headlights fully illuminated it, and I got the clearest view. It was completely covered in thick black hair, not fur like a bear, but more like coarse hair that hung from its body. The hair wasn't uniformly long. It seemed shorter on the limbs and longer on the back and shoulders. And there was this weird ridge or peak running down the center of its head, almost like a mohawk but natural. Its arms were what really got to me. They hung down at its sides, but they were way too long. They reached almost to its knees, and its hands, they looked almost hairless compared to the rest of it, with a lighter color that stood out against the black hair. I couldn't see fingers clearly, but the hands seemed massive, like they could wrap around a basketball with no problem. As I got closer, maybe 50 feet away, it slowly turned its head and glanced over its shoulder in my direction. I only caught a glimpse of its face in profile, but what I saw has been burned into my memory. I couldn't make out detailed features, but its face seemed to project forward more than a human's, with a heavy brow ridge. The hair on its face was shorter than on its body, and there was something deeply unsettling about the way it moved. Deliberate and smooth, not jerky or rushed. The weirdest part? It didn't seem startled or afraid. It just glanced at me like I was some minor annoyance and then turned back toward the woods. Like my car driving by at night on this empty road was the most normal thing in the world, and it had more important things to focus on. As I passed right by it, I was close enough that I could have reached out my passenger window and almost touched it if I'd wanted to, which I absolutely did not want to do. It was standing completely still, and I got a good sense of its height compared to the utility pole, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its shoulders were so wide they seemed almost out of proportion, giving it this powerful, top-heavy look. I didn't slow down to get a better look. In fact, as soon as I passed it, I hit the gas. My old Honda Civic doesn't accelerate very fast, but I pushed it as hard as I could. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified that this thing might decide to follow me or chase after my car. But every time I looked back, it was still standing in the same spot, motionless by the utility pole, getting smaller as the distance between us increased. I called my roommate as soon as I had phone service again, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. I was trying to explain what I'd seen, but I knew how crazy it sounded. He thought I was pulling his leg, or that I'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs, but I know what bears look like. This wasn't a bear. I barely slept that night. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, questioning if I'd really seen what I thought I saw. Could it have been someone in a costume, out in the middle of nowhere at night? Not likely. A hunter in some kind of ghillie suit. In October, not even during hunting season, standing motionless by the road, that didn't make sense either. The next day I had classes in the afternoon, so in the morning I drove back to that spot. I'm not sure what I was expecting to find. Footprints, maybe, or some other evidence. It was daylight, and I felt braver with the sun up. I found the exact utility pole. It was the only one in that stretch that had a slightly bent crossbar, which I remembered from the night before. The ground around the base of the pole was disturbed. The grass was pressed down in a circular area about 6 feet in diameter. There were no distinct footprints that I could see, just this flattened area, as if something heavy had been standing there for a while. I looked for hair that might have been caught on the wooden pole or any other signs, but there was nothing else. I took some pictures of the flattened grass with my phone, but honestly, they don't show much, just some pressed down weeds that could have been caused by anything. I showed them to a few friends, but without seeing what I saw, the pictures don't prove anything. Since that night, I've done a lot of research. I never believed in Sasquatch or Bigfoot before, but now I don't know what to think. The height, the pointed head shape, the thick black hair, the massive body structure, the long arms, it all matches descriptions I've read from other encounters. The area where I saw it has had a few reported sightings over the years, though nothing recent that I could find. What keeps bothering me is how unconcerned it seemed about me. It wasn't hiding. It was standing right next to the road. It wasn't afraid of my car or my headlights. It acted like it had every right to be there, and I was just passing through its territory. I haven't taken that shortcut at night since then. I add 15 minutes to my commute now, sticking to the main highways even though it uses more gas. Sometimes during the day, I'll drive down that road, always slowing down at that specific utility pole, always checking the tree line. I haven't seen anything else unusual there, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere in those woods. I've told this story to a few close friends, but most of them think I'm exaggerating or that my tired mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe they're right. Maybe there's some logical explanation for what I saw that night. But when I close my eyes, I can still see it perfectly. That massive, hair-covered figure standing motionless by the utility pole, glancing back at me with what felt like indifference or mild curiosity before turning away. Whatever it was, it didn't belong in our world, yet it moved through it with a confidence that suggests it's been here all along, hiding in plain sight, coming out only when it chooses to be seen. And that, more than anything else, is what keeps me up at night. Story patte. I've never told this story to anyone outside the 5 friends who were with me that night in 1997. I'm not sure why. I'm finally putting this in writing now, maybe just to process it all these years later. What happened that summer night near Cedar Creek still gives me chills whenever I think about it, and honestly, I try not to think about it much. I was 16 that summer, and camping in the woods outside Marathon, Ontario was something I'd been doing since I was a kid. My parents had a spot they'd take me to every year, a little clearing off this gas pipeline path that cut through the forest. By the time I was a teenager, I knew that area like the back of my hand. It was my special place, and that summer I wanted to share it with my friends. There were 6 of us all together. Me, Noah, my best friend Jason, his cousin Mike, who was visiting from Thunder Bay, and 3 others from our high school, Darren, Kyle, and Tyler. None of them except Jason had ever been to this spot before. I remember feeling kind of proud showing them around, pointing out the creek that ran nearby and the best spots to pitch our tents. We got there early afternoon and spent the day setting up camp, collecting firewood, and just messing around like teenagers do. We had a couple of tents, our sleeping bags, enough food for 2 days, and a cooler with sodas. Nothing fancy, just basic camping stuff. The spot was about a 2-mile hike from where we parked, so we only brought what we could carry on our backs. Everything was totally normal at first. We got a decent campfire going as the sun started setting, cooked some hot dogs, and just sat around talking about school, girls, music, normal teenage stuff. The sky was super clear that night, and I remember looking up and being blown away by how many stars you could see. You don't get that in town with all the lights. It must have been around 10 or 11 at night when things changed. We were all sitting in a circle around the fire, and I was in the middle of telling a story about this teacher we all couldn't stand, when Jason suddenly held up his hand for me to stop talking. "You guys hear that?" he asked, looking toward the creek. At first, I didn't hear anything besides the crackling of our fire and the normal forest sounds, but then it hit me. Heavy footsteps, coming from the east, from the direction of the creek bed. They were slow, deliberate footsteps. Thump, 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 evenly spaced, like whatever was making them was in no hurry. My first thought was that it was probably a bear. We'd seen bear signs earlier that day, some scat and claw marks on trees, so it seemed logical. My second thought was that maybe it was a game warden patrolling the area, though we weren't doing anything wrong and weren't in a restricted zone. "Hello?" Mike called out, his voice cracking a little. "Someone there?" No response, just those footsteps continuing, getting a little closer. "Maybe it's a ranger or something," Darren suggested, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "They would have called out or used a flashlight," I replied, feeling a growing knot in my stomach. "Rangers don't sneak up on campers in the dark." Kyle stood up, grabbing his flashlight. "I'm going to check it out." "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm. Something didn't feel right. If it was a person, why wouldn't they announce themselves? And the footsteps sounded heavy, heavier than a normal person's. That's when the smell hit us. I've spent my whole life in the outdoors, and I've smelled plenty of dead animals, bogs and stagnant water. I've smelled bears and moose and all kinds of wildlife. But this smell was different. It was like rotting meat mixed with wet fur and something else I couldn't identify. Musky and powerful and completely overwhelming. My eyes actually watered from how intense it was. "What the fuck is that smell?" Tyler whispered, pulling his shirt up over his nose. No one answered him. We were all too busy staring into the darkness at the edge of our firelight, and that's when I saw it. Or rather, I saw its outline. Whatever it was stayed just outside the direct circle of light from our fire, but I could make out its massive silhouette against the trees. It was huge, taller than any person I've ever seen. If I had to guess, I'd say at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, and wide, shoulders that seemed impossibly broad, and arms that hung down longer than they should have. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Too big, I don't know how else to say it, primitive looking. I remember my heart hammering in my chest so hard I thought it might burst. None of us spoke. What could we say? We were all seeing the same thing, this enormous figure standing at the edge of our camp, just watching us. Then it started to move. Slowly, deliberately, it began circling our campsite. It stayed in the shadows the whole time, never stepping fully into the firelight, but never going so far that we lost sight of its outline. The footsteps continued, thump, 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 heavy enough that we could feel subtle vibrations in the ground. "Should we run?" Mike whispered, his voice so quiet I barely heard him. "No," I whispered back. "We stay by the fire. If it's a bear, fire will keep it away." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk on 2 legs for that long, and they don't circle a campsite like they're studying it. The creature never made a sound other than its footsteps. No grunting, no breathing, no vocalizations of any kind. Just those heavy, methodical steps as it made its way around our camp. We all turned in place, following its movement, none of us willing to let it out of our sight. My flashlight was in my hand, but I was too scared to point it directly at the thing. Part of me didn't want to see it clearly. It took maybe 15 minutes for it to complete a full circle around our camp. 15 minutes that felt like an eternity. None of us moved from the fire and nobody said a word. We just watched this thing as it watched us. When it finished circling us, it paused for a moment on the western side of our camp. I swear it felt like it was staring right at me specifically, though I couldn't make out any features of its face in the darkness. Then it simply turned and continued westward along the creek bed, the same direction it had been heading originally. The smell lingered long after we could no longer see it or hear its footsteps. Once it was gone, we all started talking at once. What the fuck was that? Did you see how big it was? That smell, holy shit. We debated what to do. Tyler wanted to pack up immediately and hike back to the car. But it was dark, and whatever that thing was, it was out there somewhere between us and the parking area. Plus, the thought of walking through those woods in the dark after what we'd just seen. None of us were eager to do that, so we decided to stay put, to keep the fire going all night, and to leave at first light. None of us slept. Not one of us was willing to go to the tents. We just sat around that fire, jumping at every sound from the forest, taking turns adding wood to keep the flames high. We talked in hushed voices about what we'd seen. None of us wanted to say the word that was on all our minds, like naming it might somehow make it more real or bring it back. But we all knew what we were thinking. "Did you see how long its arms were?" Jason asked at one point. "Those weren't human proportions." "And the way it walked," added Darren. "It was bipedal but different, like fluid but powerful." "That smell," Mike kept saying. "I've never smelled anything like that, not even close." When the first hint of dawn finally broke through the trees, we were already packing up our gear. We didn't even bother making breakfast. No one suggested looking for tracks or going to investigate where the creature had gone. We just wanted out of there. The hike back to the car was tense. Every snapping twig made us freeze. Every bird call had us looking over our shoulders. We made it back without incident, but I don't think any of us took a full breath until we were driving away with the windows rolled up. That was 26 years ago. Over the years, the 6 of us have talked about it less and less. Whenever we do bring it up, some of the guys try to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a really tall person playing a prank, or maybe it was a bear that looked bigger in the darkness. But I know what I saw. We all do, even if most of them don't want to admit it. Based on everything, the height, the long arms, the way it walked on two legs, that distinctive smell, and especially how it deliberately circled our camp while staying in the shadows. I've become convinced of what it was. I didn't want to believe it at first. I mean, who would? But the more I've thought about it over the years, the more certain I've become. What circled our camp that night was a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot. Call it what you want, but it was real and it was intelligent. The way it circled us, studying us, that wasn't random animal behavior. It was deliberate. It was showing itself to us on purpose, letting us know we were in its territory. I've never gone back to that camping spot. I don't think I ever will. Some of the guys have moved away, started families, moved on with their lives. We don't talk about that night anymore. It's like we all silently agreed to file it away as something unexplainable that happened when we were kids. But I remember the smell, the footsteps, the silhouette. I remember how it felt to be watched by something that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm alone, I find myself listening for those footsteps again. Thump, thump, thump. And wondering if it's out there, circling someone else's campfire, letting them know they're not alone in the woods. I've read about other encounters since then, people describing similar experiences all across North America. The details are always eerily similar, the height, the smell, the behavior. It makes me wonder how many others have sat around campfires, feeling that same terror I felt, watching shadows move at the edge of the light. Whatever it was, it let us go. It could have done whatever it wanted to 6 terrified teenagers in the middle of nowhere, but it just watched us and moved on. Sometimes I think that's the most unsettling part of all. The intelligence behind those actions, the deliberate choice to reveal itself and then leave. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, half the time I'm not sure I believe it myself, but I know what I saw that night in the summer of 1997. And no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget what it felt like to be studied by something ancient and unknown in those dark Ontario woods. Story 11. I've never shared this with anyone outside my family, but it's been haunting me for almost 18 years now. I need to get this off my chest because I know what I saw that day in the fall of 2006, even if my dad now pretends he doesn't remember it clearly. I was 8 years old, living with my parents in rural Manitoba on this old farmhouse my grandparents had owned before us. It was pretty isolated. Our closest neighbors were about 2 miles away, and we were surrounded by fields and these dense woods that covered the hills behind our property. As a kid, I loved that house, despite how creaky and drafty it got. It had these big windows upstairs that gave me a perfect view of our front yard and the fields beyond. That day started like any other Saturday in October. The weather was getting colder, but it wasn't freezing yet. My parents had friends over. This couple they played cards with regularly. I remember being bored with their adult conversation, so I went upstairs to my room to play with these action figures I had. My room had this awesome window seat where I could sit and look out at everything. I'd been playing for maybe an hour when something caught my eye outside. At first I thought it might be someone walking up to our house, but within seconds I realized it wasn't a person, at least not like any person I'd ever seen. This thing was walking across our front yard, not rushing, not sneaking, just walking with purpose. It was taking these massive strides, way bigger than any normal person could make. Its arms were swinging at its sides, but they hung down way too low, past its waist. The whole body was covered in this dark hair, not like fur exactly, more like long, matted human hair, but it was everywhere, dark brown or black. I couldn't tell exactly in the afternoon light. What really got me was its shape. This wasn't someone in a costume. The proportions were all wrong. Its head sat directly on its shoulders. There was no neck, just this transition from shoulders to head. And it was huge. Even at 8, I could tell this thing was enormously tall. Later, when my dad and his friend investigated, they estimated it was about 9 feet tall. The thing that still makes my skin crawl was when it turned and looked directly at our house, at my window. I don't know if it saw me, but I saw its eyes. They caught the light in this weird way, reflecting it back. Not like a deer's eyes, but not like human eyes either. Something in between that I can't explain. I was frozen for maybe 10 seconds, just staring. Then absolute panic hit me. I dropped my toys and ran downstairs as fast as I could, practically falling down the last few steps. "Mom! Dad! There's a monster outside!" I yelled as I burst into the kitchen where they were playing cards. My dad looked annoyed at the interruption. "Marcus, what are you talking about?" "Outside! There's a big hairy monster walking in our yard." I was pointing frantically toward the front of the house. My mom gave me that look parents give when they think you're making stuff up for attention. "Honey, you were probably just seeing shadows or a deer." No, it was walking on 2 legs. It was huge and hairy and looked right at me. My dad's friend, I think his name was Bill, chuckled. "Sounds like you've been watching too many scary movies, kiddo." I was getting frustrated because they weren't listening. "I'm not making it up. Please, just come look." My dad sighed and got up. "Fine, let's go see this monster of yours." By the time we got to the window, whatever I'd seen was gone. My dad patted me on the shoulder. "See? Nothing there. Probably just your imagination." I started crying, which is embarrassing to admit, but I was so certain of what I'd seen. It was there. It was real. My mum tried to calm me down. "Marcus, maybe you just saw our neighbor walking his dog in the distance. Our neighbors don't have a dog that big, and they live miles away." I was getting hysterical. My dad decided the best way to prove there was nothing to be afraid of was to send me outside. "Go on, go play in the yard for a bit. Show yourself there's nothing scary out there." When he tried to push me toward the door, I completely lost it. I was screaming and crying, clinging to the doorframe. I'd never acted like that before, and I think that's what finally made them take me seriously. My dad exchanged looks with his friend. "All right, Bill, let's go check it out." They went outside while my mom stayed with me in the kitchen. I was still shaking and crying. My mom's friend, I think her name was Linda, made me some hot chocolate, trying to distract me, but I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes looking at me. About 20 minutes later, my dad and Bill came back in. They looked weird, not scared exactly, but definitely not like they were coming back to make fun of me anymore. "What did you find?" my mom asked. My dad hesitated, looking at me, then back at her. "There are footprints. Big ones." "What kind of footprints?" Linda asked. "Not sure," my dad said, but his voice was different. "They go right across our yard and through the plowed field out back." Bill nodded. "The stride length is incredible. I couldn't match it, even stretching as far as I could." I remember my mom's face changing. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," my dad replied. "Whatever made those tracks is big. Really big." They decided to follow the tracks. My dad and Bill took our car and drove along the property line where the footprints led. My mom and Linda stayed with me at the house. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, still shaking, while they talked in hushed voices. About an hour later, my dad and Bill came back. They'd followed the tracks to where they disappeared into the wooded hills behind our property. They didn't go into the woods. It was getting dark by then, and neither of them was eager to wander into the forest, chasing whatever had made those prints. That night, after their friends left, my parents sat me down and asked me to describe exactly what I saw. I told them everything, how tall it was, the way it moved, its arms, the hair covering its body, and those eyes that reflected light. I remember my dad writing it all down, which seemed weird to me at the time, but now I understand he was trying to document it. When I mentioned the way its head looked, kind of sloped with no forehead and these deep-set eyes, my dad got really quiet. He asked me to draw what I saw, but I was never good at drawing. My picture looked like a child's scribble, but I tried my best to show how wide its chest and shoulders were compared to its waist, how its arms hung down too far, and how its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. For a few days after that, my dad kept checking our property. He even bought a camera that he kept by the back door. My mom wouldn't let me play outside alone anymore. About a week later, they had a big argument about it. My mom wanted to move, but my dad said we couldn't afford to just up and leave. We never saw the creature again, at least not that I know of. But things changed after that. My dad started locking all the doors at night, which he never used to do. He installed brighter outdoor lights, and for months I was too scared to sleep with my curtains open or look out my window after dark. As the years passed, my parents stopped talking about it. When I brought it up as a teenager, my dad would just say, "That was a strange day," and change the subject. Now, at 26, when I mention it to him, he claims he doesn't remember it clearly, says it was probably just a large bear walking upright or a neighbor playing a prank. But I know what I saw. I've researched Sasquatch sightings since then, and so many details match up with other accounts. The lack of neck, the long arms, the stride length, the way the eyes reflected light. I've never seen anything like it since, but I know it was real. The worst part is not knowing. Did it live in those woods? Was it just passing through? Did it ever come back when we weren't looking? And why did it look directly at me that day? I still live in Manitoba, but nowhere near our old house. I avoid heavily wooded areas, especially at dusk. I've tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but those footprints were real. My dad and his friends saw them. They couldn't explain them. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else in that area has seen something similar. I've thought about going back, maybe talking to the current owners of the house, but part of me is afraid of what I might find out, or worse, what might find me if I start asking questions. I just needed to share this somewhere people might understand. I know what I saw that day wasn't human. I just wish I knew what it was. Story 12. It happened last Thanksgiving night, November 23rd, 2023. The memory is burned into my brain like a brand. I had just dropped off my friend Kayla after we'd had a late dinner together. Her family always does Thanksgiving at like 3 in the afternoon, but mine does it earlier, so we've made it a tradition to hang out later in the evening. I left her place around 11:30 at night. I was driving through Pemberton Township on Route 70. If you're not familiar with the area, it's this long stretch of road that cuts right through these dense woods. There aren't many houses out there, and at that time of night, there wasn't another car in sight. The road was completely empty, just me and my headlights cutting through the darkness. I had the heat blasting because it was freezing that night. I remember I was listening to this true crime podcast, ironically enough, just to keep myself alert on the drive home. It was about a 30-minute drive back to my place, and I was only about 10 minutes in. I came around this bend in the road. I drive this route all the time, so I wasn't worried about it, when something moved on the right side of the road. It was just this dark shape at first, and my brain immediately went to deer, because they're everywhere around here. I slowed down a bit, which is just instinct when you live in an area with a lot of wildlife, but then this thing started to cross the road, and I had to slam on my brakes. My car skidded a little, and I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The podcast was still playing, but I couldn't hear it anymore. All I could focus on was what was crossing in front of my car. At first, I thought maybe it was a big dog that had gotten loose. But as I watched it move from the right side of the road to the left, I realized it wasn't a dog. It wasn't anything I recognized. This thing was moving on all fours, but not like a normal four-legged animal. It was low to the ground, completely black, not just dark-colored, but like it was absorbing the light around it. The front limbs were weirdly long compared to the back ones, which made its movement look wrong. It didn't move like anything I've ever seen before. Not like a bear, not like a deer, not like a coyote or a fox or any animal that should be in those woods. The way it moved was what freaked me out the most. It was fluid but unnatural, like its joints bent in ways they shouldn't. The front limbs seemed to pull the body forward in this crawling motion that made my skin crawl just watching it. I sat there, foot pressed hard on the brake, just watching this thing cross the road. It wasn't in a hurry. It was deliberate, like it didn't care that I was there, like it owned the road. When it reached the other side, that's when things got worse. It stopped and turned toward my car. I could see its eyes in my headlights. They were glowing orange, like embers from a fire, not reflecting like a normal animal's eyes would. They were actually glowing. I couldn't move. I literally could not move my body. It was like I was frozen in place, just staring at this thing while it stared back at me. I don't know how long we stayed like that. It could have been 10 seconds or 2 minutes. Time kind of lost meaning. I started crying without even realizing it, not sobbing or anything, just these involuntary tears running down my face. My whole body was covered in goosebumps, and I had this cold feeling washing over me in waves. It wasn't just fear. It was like my body was reacting to something my mind couldn't fully process. Then, the thing just turned away and disappeared into the trees on the left side of the road. The moment it was gone, it was like someone had released me from a spell. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and tore out of there. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. The whole drive home, it was only about 4 miles, but it felt like 40. I kept checking my mirrors, convinced that the thing was somehow following me. I was terrified it would suddenly appear in my back seat or jump out in front of my car again. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I ran inside so fast I forgot to lock my car. I woke up my mom, Olivia, right away. I was hysterical, barely able to get the words out. I kept saying, "There was something on the road, Mom. Something not right." She sat me down at the kitchen table and made me some tea while I tried to explain what I'd seen. I must have sounded completely insane, but she listened. She didn't laugh or tell me I was being ridiculous. She just listened and nodded and told me she believed me. "Madison," she said, "I've lived in New Jersey my whole life, and there are things in these woods that not everyone sees." That was it. She didn't elaborate, just gave me this look like she knew more than she was saying. The next day, I tried to tell a couple of my friends about it. Big mistake. They all thought I was making it up, or that I'd seen a mangy bear or something. One of them even suggested I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. I got so tired of the eye rolls and the sure Madison responses that I just stopped talking about it. I started calling it the Black Demon in my head because I didn't know what else to call it. It wasn't a cryptid I'd ever heard of before. It wasn't Bigfoot or the Jersey Devil or anything like that. It was something else entirely. For weeks after, I avoided driving at night. When I had to, I would take the longest, most populated routes possible, even if it added an extra 20 minutes to my trip. I kept my doors locked constantly and started sleeping with my bedroom light on. I became hyper-aware of every sound outside my window at night. About a month later, I was at a family gathering when my cousin Rebecca pulled me aside. She looked nervous, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Maddie," she said, using my nickname, "I heard you saw something weird on Route 70. My heart started racing. "Who told you that?" "Your mom mentioned it to my mom, and she told me because—" She paused, looking uncomfortable. "Because I saw something too. Near that little bridge by the fire station, not far from where you were. The fire station is maybe a mile from where I had my encounter. I felt a chill run down my spine." "What did you see?" I asked her. Rebecca described something that sounded eerily similar to what I had seen. She said it looked like a cross between a monkey and a kangaroo, but completely black and moving in a way that made her feel sick to her stomach. She had been driving home from a late shift at the hospital where she works as a nurse, and she only caught a glimpse of it as it darted across the road. "I've been scared to tell anyone," she admitted. "I thought people would think I was crazy." "I know exactly how you feel," I told her. After that, I started doing some research. I looked up weird animal sightings in New Jersey, unknown creatures, anything that might give me some answers. Most of what I found was about the Jersey Devil, which didn't match what I saw at all. Then, about 6 months after my encounter, I was scrolling through a forum about unexplained creature sightings when I came across a photo someone had posted. They called it the Jacob's creature, and the moment I saw it, my blood ran cold. It looked so similar to what I had seen: the low profile, the dark coloration, the unnaturally long front limbs. The post described the strange movement pattern and the glowing eyes. I immediately reached out to the person who posted it, but they never responded. The post was eventually removed from the forum, and when I went back to look for it later, I couldn't find any trace of it or the Jacob's creature anywhere else online. I've lived in this area my whole life. I know what deer look like, what bears look like, what coyotes and foxes and stray dogs look like. I know all the wildlife that's supposed to be in these woods. What I saw that night wasn't any of those things. Sometimes I try to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just a bear with mange, or some kind of deformed animal. But then I remember those orange eyes staring at me, and the way my body reacted before my mind could even process what I was seeing. That visceral, instinctive fear isn't something you can fake or imagine. I still drive that stretch of Route 70 sometimes, but never at night if I can help it. When I do have to, I drive as fast as legally possible, windows up, doors locked, eyes straight ahead. I don't want to see it again. I don't want confirmation that what I saw was real, but deep down, I know it was. And sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night and I hear something moving outside, I wonder if it's out there, watching my house, remembering me the way I remember it. The worst part is not knowing what it was, where it came from, or if anyone else has seen it besides Rebecca and me, not knowing if it's still out there in those woods, watching and waiting, not knowing if I'll ever have an explanation for what I saw that night. I still can't drive that road without my heart racing and my palms sweating. I still can't shake the image of those glowing orange eyes from my mind, and I still can't explain what I saw on Thanksgiving night, no matter how hard I try. Sometimes I think about going back there with a camera, trying to find evidence, but the truth is I'm too scared. Whatever that thing was, it didn't feel like something that should exist in our world. It felt wrong on a fundamental level. And part of me thinks that some things are better left unseen and unexplained. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Story 13. I still don't know what to make of what happened to me back in '88. I've kept this story mostly to myself for years because, well, who'd believe me? But after seeing others share similar experiences, I figure it's time to put mine out there too. It was late October of 1988. My buddy Dale and I had been planning our annual deer hunting trip for months. We'd chosen the Diamond Peak Wilderness area south of Highway 58 near Cascade Summit in Oregon. Beautiful country, dense forests, steep terrain, and supposedly good deer population. Dale had hunted there once before with his uncle and swore it was prime territory. We arrived later than planned because my old Ford had trouble pulling the small travel trailer up some of the mountain roads. By the time we found a suitable spot to set up camp, it was already getting dark. We quickly unhitched the trailer, leveled it best we could, and got a small fire going to cook some dinner. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I finally crawled into my sleeping bag. Dale was already snoring loud enough to scare away any wildlife within a mile radius. I was exhausted but having trouble falling asleep in the unfamiliar surroundings. The forest sounds were different from what I was used to back home in Washington. That's when I first heard it, a distinct thumping noise coming from somewhere south of us toward the wilderness area. At first, I thought maybe it was just a deer or elk moving through the underbrush. But there was something rhythmic about it, almost deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. Then silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then again, thump, thump, thump. It wasn't constant enough to be machinery, and it didn't sound like any animal I was familiar with. I nudged Dale, but he just grunted and rolled over. The man could sleep through an earthquake. I considered going outside to investigate, but decided against it. It was pitch black, we were in unfamiliar territory, and I was too tired to go stumbling around in the dark. Eventually, the thumping stopped, or maybe I just fell asleep. Either way, I didn't think much of it by morning. We were up before sunrise getting our gear ready. The plan was to split up and cover more ground, then meet back at camp by late afternoon. We'd follow a creek that ran through the area, with Dale taking the west side and me the east. Simple enough. Remember, 2 short whistles if you get something, Dale reminded me as we parted ways. It was our usual signal. 2 whistles meant, "Come help me with this deer I just shot." The morning was crisp and clear, perfect hunting weather. I moved slowly through the forest, scanning for any movement, any flash of brown among the trees. 4 hours in, I hadn't seen a single deer, just some old tracks and droppings. Around 11 o'clock, I crossed back over the creek to check on Dale's progress. Found him leaning against a tree stump, fast asleep with his rifle across his lap. Typical Dale. I considered waking him, but decided to let him be. He'd had a rough week at work before our trip, and honestly, I was enjoying the solitude. I continued on alone, moving deeper into the wilderness than we'd originally planned. The terrain got rougher, with more deadfall and thicker underbrush. It was slow going, but I kept pushing forward, hoping to find a good spot where deer might come to drink. By early afternoon, I was in an area so dense with brush that I could barely see 10 feet ahead. It was getting frustrating, and I was about to turn back when I spotted what looked like a small clearing ahead. I pushed through the final stretch of brush and found myself at the bottom of a steep dirt bank, maybe 10 feet high. Something about that bank caught my attention immediately. There were these odd depressions going up it, like something had climbed it recently. Now I've been hunting since I was 12 years old. I know what deer tracks look like. I know what elk tracks look like. These weren't either. Curiosity got the better of me. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and started climbing the bank, using small shrubs and exposed roots to pull myself up. It was steep enough that I had to dig the toes of my boots in to get traction. When I reached the top, I was breathing heavy. Not just from the exertion. Right there, perfectly preserved in the soft dirt, was what appeared to be half a footprint. Not a whole print, mind you, just from the toes to the ball of the foot, but it was massive. I'm not one to exaggerate, especially about something like this, but that partial print was about 7.5 inches across at its widest point. And there were 5 toes clearly visible, 5 human-like toes. My heart started hammering in my chest. I knelt down to examine it closer, placing my own boot next to it for comparison. My size 11 boot looked small beside it. I pressed my thumb into the soft dirt nearby to test the consistency, and that's when I realized something else. The impression was deep. At least 2.5 times deeper than the prints my own boots were making, and I weighed about 200 pounds at the time. It suddenly made perfect sense why it was only half a print. When you climb a steep bank like that, you don't use your whole foot. You dig in with the front part, the ball and toes, to push yourself up. Whatever made this print had been climbing just like I had. I looked around frantically for more prints, but the ground at the top was harder, covered with pine needles and forest debris. No clear tracks. I cursed myself for not bringing a camera. Who goes hunting without a camera? Me, apparently. I sat there for a good 20 minutes just staring at that print, trying to process what I was seeing. I'd heard stories about Bigfoot all my life. Who hasn't in the Pacific Northwest? But I'd always been skeptical. Dale especially was a hardcore non-believer. He'd laugh me out of camp if I brought this up without evidence. The longer I stared at that print, the more my mind raced. That thumping sound from the night before suddenly took on new significance. Could it have been something large moving through the forest? Something bipedal? I decided to explore the area a bit more before heading back. About 50 yards from the bank, I found a small clearing where something had clearly bedded down. The grass and undergrowth were flattened in an oval shape much larger than a deer would make. Around the perimeter, I noticed broken branches on some of the surrounding bushes at a height of about 7 to 8 feet off the ground, too high for a deer or even an elk to browse. My watch showed it was after 3 o'clock. I needed to start heading back if I wanted to reach camp before dark. With one last look at the print, I began my return journey. I moved faster now, constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the forest around me. Every sound made me jump. That crack of a twig, was it just a squirrel? That rustling in the underbrush, just the wind? I found Dale right where I'd left him, though now he was awake and looking annoyed. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded. "I've been waiting for over an hour." I almost told him then, the words were on the tip of my tongue. But I knew Dale. He'd either think I was pulling his leg or worse, that I actually believed in that Bigfoot nonsense, as he called it. So I just shrugged and made up some excuse about following a promising game trail that didn't pan out. That night back at camp, I couldn't sleep. Every sound from the forest had me on edge. That thumping noise didn't return, but around midnight I heard something that made my blood run cold, a long, high-pitched wail that started low and rose in pitch before tapering off. It came from roughly the same direction as the thumping the night before. It wasn't a cougar scream or an elk bugle or any animal sound I'd ever heard before. Dale heard it too. He sat up in his sleeping bag, eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. "Probably just a cougar," I lied, not wanting to start a discussion about what I really thought it might be. "No way that was a cougar," Dale insisted, but he didn't offer any alternative explanation. We cut our hunting trip short the next day, claiming bad weather was moving in. In reality, neither of us was keen on venturing back into those woods. We never talked about what we heard that night, and I never told Dale about the print I found. Years later, in 1993, I came across a small article in the local newspaper. A group of hunters in the Diamond Peak Wilderness area had reported hearing strange, unexplainable screams at night. They described it exactly as what Dale and I had heard. The article mentioned that the area had a history of reported Bigfoot sightings dating back to the 1960s. That's when I finally accepted what I'd been trying to rationalize away for years. That print I found wasn't from a bear standing upright. Bears don't have 5 distinct toes like that. It wasn't from another hunter. No human foot is that wide or would sink so deep into the soil. And that sound we heard wasn't any known wildlife in the Pacific Northwest. I've been back to Diamond Peak twice since then, both times with a camera. Never found anything conclusive again, but each time I got that same feeling of being watched, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck that tells you you're not alone in the forest. I don't know what's out there in those woods. I don't claim to have seen a Sasquatch face to face, but that print and those sounds, they've stayed with me for over 30 years now. Some things you just can't explain away, no matter how hard you try. And sometimes the most unbelievable explanation is the only one that makes any sense at all. Story 14. I still get chills thinking about what happened to me that night. I've always been a rational person, never believed in cryptids or anything paranormal, but I can't explain what I saw. This happened in early 2004, late fall. I was driving back from visiting my brother in Athens, Georgia, and took a shortcut through some back roads that follow the Chattahoochee River. It was around 11:30 at night, no moon, just pitch black with my headlights cutting through the darkness. I'm from this area, so I know these roads pretty well, but I'd never driven this particular stretch so late before. The road twisted through dense forest for miles with no streetlights or houses, just wilderness on both sides. I had the radio on low, some late-night talk show, and was just focused on getting home after a long day. I was tired but alert, You know how it is when you're driving alone at night and your senses seem heightened. I remember thinking how isolated it felt out there, miles from anything. About halfway through this 20-mile stretch, something caught my eye ahead. At first I thought it was a deer. We get tons of them around here, and hitting one could total your car. But as I got closer, I realized whatever was crossing the road was walking on two legs, and it was big. My headlights caught it for maybe 3 seconds. It was moving from left to right across the road about 50 yards ahead of me. The way it moved was what struck me first. Smooth and quick, but not running. Just purposeful strides that covered ground faster than a person could walk. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, with broad shoulders and completely covered in dark hair or fur. I instinctively slowed down, but before I could get a better look, it disappeared into the tree line on my right. I remember my hands were suddenly sweating on the steering wheel. I'd never seen anything move like that. Definitely not a bear or a person in a costume. Bears don't walk upright for that long, and this thing's proportions were all wrong for a bear anyway. I slowed down when I reached the spot where it crossed, looking into the woods, but couldn't see anything. The forest was too thick, too dark. I considered stopping completely, but something in my gut told me that was a bad idea. So I kept driving, a bit slower now, trying to process what I'd just seen. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone playing a prank, or maybe my tired mind was playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. That thing was real, and it wasn't human. About 4 miles further down the road, I was still shaken up, but had convinced myself I was overreacting. Then I noticed some movement in the woods to my right. I don't know why, but I slowed down again. Something was watching me from about 20 yards into the tree line. At first, all I could see were 2 eyes reflecting my headlights. Bright red reflections, like when you catch a deer in your high beams, except these were higher up, at least 6 feet off the ground, and they were bigger than any animal eyes I'd ever seen. I slowed almost to a stop, which was stupid in hindsight. The eyes moved, and whatever they belonged to stepped partially out of the trees, just enough to catch the edge of my headlights. I'll never forget what I saw. It was similar to what crossed the road earlier, but now I could see more details. It stood fully upright, at least 7 feet tall, with dark brown or black hair covering its body. The build was massive, not fat but muscular, with shoulders twice as wide as mine. Its arms hung longer than a human's would, and I could see massive hands with what looked like fingers, not paws. The face stayed mostly in shadow, but I could make out a pronounced brow ridge and a flatter nose than a human's. The eyes were what got me, though, large and intense, and when they caught my headlights, they reflected that eerie red glow. The most unsettling thing was how it just stood there watching me, not running away like a normal animal would, not afraid at all, just observing. I felt like I was being studied, and I can't describe how vulnerable that made me feel, like I was the one out of place, not it. I don't know how long we stared at each other, probably only 5 or 10 seconds, but it felt like minutes. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then, without thinking, I hit the gas and sped away. I didn't look back. I just drove straight home, doing at least 20 over the speed limit the whole way. When I got home, I was still shaking. My wife was already asleep and I didn't wake her. What would I even say? "Hey, honey, I think I just saw Bigfoot. Twice." I knew how that would sound. So I just sat in the kitchen until 3 in the morning, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The next day, I didn't tell anyone. I went to work like normal, but I couldn't focus. I kept replaying those encounters in my head, trying to find some reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a bear with mange that made it look less furry. No, the way it moved was all wrong. A person in a costume, out in the middle of nowhere late at night. And that size and build would be almost impossible to fake convincingly. A week went by before I finally broke down and started researching online. I typed in Bigfoot sightings Georgia and was shocked at how many reports came up from areas around the Chattahoochee. Some descriptions matched exactly what I'd seen. The height, The movement, the red eye shine. People had been reporting similar sightings in those woods since the 70s. I found a forum where people shared their experiences, and reading through them gave me chills. One guy described seeing a creature crossing the road near where I had my encounter, and his description was eerily similar. Another person reported finding strange footprints along the river just a couple miles from where I saw the eyes in the woods. After about a month, my curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to that area during daylight hours. I was nervous as hell, but I had to know if there was any evidence of what I'd seen. I parked near where I remembered seeing the eyes and walked into the woods. About 30 yards in, I found an area where several large branches had been broken off trees, about 8 feet up, higher than a person could reach. The breaks looked fresh, maybe a week old. Further in, near a small creek, I found what looked like footprints in the mud. They were partly washed away by rain, but what remained was enough to make my skin crawl. They were huge, at least 16 inches long, and clearly shaped like a foot, not a paw. They had 5 toes and a distinct arch, like a human foot, but twice the size. I've been back to that area several times since then. Always during the day, I found more broken branches, more partial footprints, and once what looked like a crude shelter made of leaning branches against a rock face. But I've never seen the creatures again. I've still only told a handful of people about what happened. My wife knows now, and while she doesn't dismiss it outright, I can tell she thinks I might have seen a bear, and my imagination filled in the rest. A couple of close friends know too, and their reactions range from fascination to obvious skepticism. The thing is, I understand the skepticism. If someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I'd have thought they were exaggerating or confused too, but I know what I saw. Those weren't bears, they weren't people in suits. They moved too naturally, too purposefully. And those eyes, I still see them in my dreams sometimes. I don't have any photos or videos. I wasn't prepared that night, and honestly, I was too shaken to think about grabbing my phone. All I have are my memories and the few signs I've found in the woods since. It's not proof that would convince a scientist. I know that, but I also know that I'm not alone in what I've seen. Too many others have reported similar encounters in those woods. There's something out there that science hasn't classified yet, something that stays hidden most of the time, but occasionally lets itself be seen. I still drive that road sometimes, always during daylight now. And every time I pass those spots, I scan the tree line, wondering if they're watching me again, from just beyond where I can see. I don't know what they are or why they're there, but after what I experienced that night, I know they exist, and nothing anyone says will ever convince me otherwise. Story 15. I've never really talked about this publicly before. It happened back in '93, and I still don't have a good explanation for what I saw that day. Part of me doesn't want to remember it, but another part knows I'll never forget it as long as I live. It was early May 1993, and me and 3 buddies, Jim, Rick, and Dave, decided to head up above Helen, Georgia for some trout fishing. I'd been going to those mountains for years. My granddad used to take me up there when I was just a kid, so I knew some good spots where the rainbow trout would be biting. We got to the river around 7 in the morning. Perfect day for fishing, not too hot yet, sun just coming up over the trees. We found a nice stretch of river with some deep pools where the trout like to hide. I'm a big guy, 6'3", 300 pounds, but I've always been pretty good at moving quiet along a riverbank when I'm fishing. After a couple hours, we'd caught a few decent-sized fish. Nothing spectacular. I started getting restless. I've always been the type who wants to see what's around the next bend. Jim was feeling the same way, while Rick and Dave were content to stay put. "Hey, Jim," I said. "Want to head upriver a bit? I know there's some good spots up that way." Jim was game, so we told Rick and Dave we'd be back in a couple hours and started following this old logging roadbed that runs parallel to the river. It's not really a road anymore, hasn't been used for actual logging in decades, but it makes for easier walking than pushing through the underbrush. We'd gone maybe half a mile up this old roadbed, taking our time, when we came to this washed-out gully cutting across the path. Nothing major, just where rainwater had carved a little ravine about 4 feet deep. We stopped there to catch our breath and decide if we wanted to keep going. That's when it happened. We were just standing there talking when we heard this heavy thud behind us, not like a twig snapping or an animal scurrying. This was substantial. Something heavy hitting the ground. We both turned around at the same time, and there across the path we'd just walked was this massive log. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was about 10 feet long and as thick as a car tire. I remember looking at Jim, and he had this expression I'd never seen on him before. Kind of a confused fear. "Did you see that fall?" I asked him. "No," Jim said, his voice real quiet. "Did you?" I hadn't. Neither of us had seen or heard it falling. Just the impact when it hit the ground. And here's the thing that really got to me. We had walked that exact spot not more than 5 minutes earlier. There was no log there then, and it wasn't like it could have rolled there. The ground was relatively flat, and this thing was lying perfectly perpendicular across the path. I felt a chill run up my spine. Something wasn't right. In all my years in the woods, I'd never seen a log just appear like that. "Maybe we should head back," Jim suggested. I nodded, but first I wanted to take a closer look at this log. I walked over and examined it, fresh breaks on both ends. This wasn't some rotten deadfall that finally gave way. Something had snapped this off and placed it there while we were standing not 50 yards away. We climbed over the log and started heading back toward Rick and Dave. We'd gone maybe 50 yards when I heard something moving on the slope above us. Not small animal movement. This was heavy, deliberate movement, breaking branches. I glanced up the slope and my whole body went cold. Standing in the brush about 10 to 15 feet up the hill was something. At first my brain tried to process it as a bear, but I knew immediately it wasn't. I've seen plenty of bears in these woods. This was standing upright, perfectly still, watching us. It was massive. I'm a big guy, like I said, but I felt small looking at this thing. It had to be at least 9 feet tall, with shoulders about 4 feet wide. It was covered in long, dark hair that had this weird shine to it in the dappled sunlight coming through the trees. Not fur like a bear, more like hair. And its face, God, its face. It had these eyes that I'll never forget, reddish brown, almost amber, and they were fixed right on us with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. "Jim," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the creature. "Do you see that?" I heard Jim make a sound like he was trying to speak, but couldn't get the words out. Then he just said, "Run." We took off down that old roadbed faster than I've ever moved in my life. I'm not a runner, never have been. But fear is a powerful motivator. We sprinted all the way back to where Rick and Dave were still fishing, probably a quarter mile. By the time we got there, we were both gasping for breath, covered in sweat. Rick looked up from his fishing rod. "What the hell happened to you two?" Between gulps of air, we tried to explain what we'd seen. I could tell they didn't believe us. Dave actually laughed, thinking we were playing some kind of prank. "I'm serious," I insisted. "There's something up there. It wasn't a bear." "Then what was it?" Dave asked, still smirking. I hesitated before answering. "I think it was a Bigfoot." That got an even bigger laugh from Dave. Rick at least had the decency to look concerned about how shaken up we were. "Look," I said, "I know how it sounds. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But that thing was real, and it deliberately put that log across the path." After about an hour of back and forth, I finally convinced Rick and Dave to come back up the trail with me. Jim flat out refused to go. Can't say I blame him. I probably wouldn't have gone back either if I hadn't been so determined to prove we weren't crazy. As we walked, I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of the creature. About halfway to where we had seen it, I spotted something in a muddy patch beside the trail. A footprint. Not human, not bear. This thing was huge, maybe 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. I called Rick and Dave over to look. Could be anything, Dave said, but I could tell he was getting nervous. We continued on, and eventually found the log still lying across the path, exactly where we'd left it. I pointed up to where I'd seen the creature standing, but there was nothing there now, no sign of it anywhere. "So you're saying this log wasn't here when you walked up?" Rick asked, examining it. "No, it wasn't. We heard it drop behind us after we passed this spot." Dave ran his hand along the log. "And you think your Bigfoot put it here?" I nodded. "I know it sounds crazy." We stood there for a few minutes, all of us scanning the woods. I could tell Rick was starting to believe something weird had happened, but Dave was still skeptical. After a while, we headed back to Jim and packed up our gear. None of us felt much like fishing anymore. That night at the cabin we'd rented, we stayed up late talking about what Jim and I had seen. By morning, the whole thing had taken on an almost dreamlike quality, but I knew what I saw, and I knew it was real. In the years since then, I've gone back to that same river many times. Never alone, though. I won't fish those woods by myself anymore. And I've had other experiences up there. Nothing as direct as that day, but enough to convince me that there's something living in those mountains that science hasn't classified yet. I've heard wood knocks echoing through the trees, sharp, deliberate knocks that don't sound like natural forest noises. I've heard vocalizations at dusk that made the hair on my arms stand up. Not an owl, not a coyote, not anything I can identify. 3 years after the initial encounter, I had rocks thrown in my direction while fishing a remote stretch of that same river. Not falling rocks, thrown rocks that landed with purpose about 10 feet from where I was standing. The strangest thing is how the woods feel different sometimes. There are days when everything seems normal. Birds singing, squirrels chattering, just a regular day in the forest. And then there are days when the woods get quiet, when you can feel the weight of eyes watching you, when every instinct in your body is screaming that you're not alone. Jim refuses to go back to that spot. Rick and Dave still fish with me sometimes, but they won't talk about what happened that day. I think they've convinced themselves there's a rational explanation. Maybe there is, but I know what I saw. That creature was massive, intelligent, and deliberate in its actions. It placed that log to stop us from going further upriver. It wanted us to know we were in its territory. And when we turned around, it made sure we saw it, made sure we knew exactly why we were being turned back. I've read about other Bigfoot encounters since then, trying to make sense of what happened. Some people describe feeling terror, but what I remember most was the sense of being small, of being in the presence of something ancient and powerful that belonged in those woods in a way I never would. I still go fishing in North Georgia, still love those mountains, but I keep a more respectful distance now, and sometimes when I'm on that river and the woods go quiet, I can feel those reddish-brown eyes watching me from the tree line, waiting, reminding me that I'm just a visitor in a place that belongs to something else. I've never seen it as clearly as I did that day in May 1993, but I know it's still there, and I know it remembers me too. Story 16. I still have trouble sleeping some nights. I keep hearing that scream in my head. I'm not usually the type to share personal stuff online, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone else has gone through something similar and can make sense of what happened to us back in August 2022. It was supposed to be a chill weekend with friends. My buddy Jake's family has this property outside Coos Bay, Oregon. Nothing fancy, just a modest house on about 3 acres with woods surrounding most of it. The kind of place where you can actually see the stars at night, you know? Jake invited me and 4 other friends to hang out for a long weekend. No cell service, no internet, just us, some beers and nature. The first 2 days were exactly what we needed. We hiked during the day, cooked meals together, played cards. Normal stuff. Jake's place had this great fire pit in the backyard, maybe 50 yards from the house. There was an old wooden fence marking the edge of the cleared property before the forest took over. Probably been there since the 80s from the look of it. Nothing special, just typical post and rail, weathered grey from years in the Pacific Northwest climate. On our third night, we were sitting around the fire pit. Me, Jake, his girlfriend Amber, our friends Mike, Sarah and Chris. It was around 11:30 at night. We'd been drinking a bit, telling stories, laughing. The normal stuff you do around a campfire. The first scream came out of nowhere. I've been in the woods a lot in my life. I've heard coyotes, owls, all kinds of wildlife. This wasn't that. This was Jesus. I don't even know how to describe it. It was like a roar and a scream combined, but with this weird human quality to it that made my skin crawl. It came from somewhere in the trees beyond the eastern fence line. "What the hell was that?" Mike asked. Everyone got quiet. We all stared toward the woods. The fire wasn't very big, so beyond our circle was just darkness. Jake had installed one of those motion sensor lights near the house, but it didn't reach all the way to where we were sitting. "Probably just a cougar," Jake said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Then we heard it again, louder this time, and it wasn't just the sound. It was the feeling that came with it, like the air around us changed, got heavier somehow. "That's not a cougar," Sarah whispered. We kept listening, and that's when I noticed the quiet, no crickets, no nightbirds, nothing, just dead silence except for our breathing and the crackling of the fire. Then came the footfalls. At first, they were distant, heavy thuds that seemed to be moving parallel to the fence line, but they were getting closer. And they weren't the sound of a deer or even a bear. Each impact literally vibrated the ground. I could feel it through the camping chair I was sitting in. Chris stood up first. "We should go inside." His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the fear in it. "Hold on," Jake said, reaching for the high-powered flashlight he'd brought out earlier. "Let me see what's out there." The footfalls were getting closer, faster. Whatever it was running now, coming straight toward us. I stood up too, my heart hammering in my chest. Amber grabbed Jake's arm, trying to pull him toward the house. That's when it hit the fence. The impact was so violent it sounded like a car crash. Wood splintered and cracked. Jake swung the flashlight toward the sound, and for just a second, literally just a flash, I saw it. It was massive. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing would have towered over me. Its body was covered in dark, shaggy hair. Not fur like a bear, but longer, more human-like somehow. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, and its arms, its arms hung down almost to its knees. The beam of light caught its face for just a moment before Jake dropped the flashlight. I'll never forget what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The face had this heavy brow ridge, and underneath it, eyes that reflected the light like an animal's, but with an intelligence that scared me more than anything. It screamed again, and holy shit, I felt it physically hit my chest like a pressure wave. That's when we all ran. We sprinted for the house, all 6 of us, stumbling over each other. Behind us, I could hear more crashing, more wood breaking. The thing was destroying the fence, smashing through it like it was made of toothpicks. Jake got to the door first, fumbling with his keys while the rest of us crowded the porch. I looked back over my shoulder and saw the motion light by the house had triggered. It illuminated part of the yard, including our abandoned fire pit. The creature was still in the shadows beyond the light's reach, but I could hear it tearing through what remained of the fence. We burst into the house, and Jake locked the door behind us. We rushed to the kitchen windows, which faced the backyard. The motion light was still on, casting that harsh, yellowish glow over the yard, and then it stepped into the light. I wish I could say my eyes were playing tricks on me. I wish I could blame it on the beers or the darkness or anything else. But we all saw it. All 6 of us, standing there in the kitchen, watching through the windows. It was a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds, believe me. I never thought I'd be the guy telling a Bigfoot story on the internet. But that's what it was. It stood fully upright in the motion light, at least 8 feet tall. Its shoulders were wider than the nearby tool shed. The hair covering its body was dark brown or black and hung in matted clumps in some places. Its head sat directly on those massive shoulders, hardly any neck visible. The face is what I remember most clearly, that wide, heavy brow, deep-set eyes that looked almost sunken in, a broad, flat nose, and a mouth that seemed too wide for its face. It wasn't like the goofy pictures you see on beef jerky packages or whatever. This thing was primal, powerful, and it was furious. It walked over to our fire pit, circling it slowly. Then it stopped, turned its head toward the house and stared directly at us. I swear to God it knew exactly where we were, even though we'd turned off the kitchen light. It let out this low growl that somehow carried all the way to the house. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and walked back toward the woods. Not running now, just walking with this swinging gait that looked both awkward and powerful at the same time. It disappeared into the trees, and a few seconds later the motion light clicked off. None of us moved for a long time. I don't think any of us were even breathing. "What the actual fuck was that?" Chris finally whispered. Jake shook his head. "I don't know." "That was a Bigfoot," Amber said flatly. "We all saw it." "That's impossible," Mike said, but there was no conviction in his voice. We stayed up all night, huddled in the living room with all the lights on. Nobody wanted to be alone. Nobody wanted to look out the windows. We just sat there, jumping at every sound from outside. When dawn finally came, Jake and I worked up the courage to go outside and check the damage. The others stayed in the house, watching us through the windows. The fence was completely destroyed, not just broken, torn apart. 3 fence posts had been completely shattered, not just broken but literally splintered like they'd been hit with a sledgehammer. The rails were scattered across the yard. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the footprints. They circled the fire pit exactly like we'd seen the creature do. Each print was over 18 inches long and deeply pressed into the ground. They had 5 toes. They were shaped like a human foot, but massive. We followed them back to where they'd come from, a path of trampled grass leading straight into the woods. We packed up and left that morning. Nobody argued about cutting the trip short. The drive back to town was almost completely silent. I've spent months trying to make sense of what happened. I've researched Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest. I've talked to the others who were there. We're all struggling with it in different ways. Mike refuses to talk about it at all. Sarah has gone deep into research, joining Bigfoot enthusiast groups. Jake hasn't been back to the property since. As for me, I keep thinking about the way it behaved, the screaming before it attacked the fence, the deliberate way it circled our fire pit after we fled, the way it looked at the house before leaving. I don't think it was just a random encounter. This thing wasn't just passing through. It felt territorial, deliberate, like it was sending us a message. Get out. This is my place. And it worked. Jake's family has owned that property for over 30 years, and they'd never seen anything like this before. But I can't help wondering if others have. The nearest neighbor is over a mile away. How many people have encountered this thing and kept quiet? How long has it been there, watching from the trees? I don't know if I'll ever go back to Coos Bay. I don't know if I'll ever sit around a campfire in the woods again without listening for that scream. All I know is that 6 people saw something impossible that night, something that shouldn't exist but does. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I swear I can feel those footsteps vibrating through the ground again. I can hear that scream that hits you physically in the chest. And I know whatever that thing was, it's still out there in those woods, waiting for the next people who think they own a piece of its territory. Story 17. I've been sitting on this for almost 18 years now. I've told exactly 3 people. My brother, my best friend, and my wife. And even they look at me with that mix of concern and doubt that makes me wish I'd never opened my mouth. But I need to get this out somewhere, even if it's just typing it to strangers who'll probably think I'm making it up or was on something. I wasn't. I know what happened that night in the Green Mountains back in 2006, and it still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I was 27 then, working a soul-crushing IT job in Boston that had me staring at screens all day, troubleshooting network issues for people who could barely operate a mouse. By June, I was mentally fried. I needed space, silence, and absolutely zero human contact. So I took a week off, threw my camping gear in my Subaru, and headed north to Vermont's Green Mountain National Forest. I'd camped there before, but always stuck to the designated areas. This time, I wanted real solitude. I found a spot about half a mile off one of the marked trails, far enough to feel isolated but close enough that I wouldn't get completely lost. It was this beautiful little clearing, surrounded by dense pines and maples, with a small stream about 100 yards away. Perfect. The first 3 days were exactly what I needed. I'd wake with the sun, make coffee on my little camp stove, then spend the day hiking or fishing. The weather was ideal. Warm days, cool nights, not too many bugs. I'd fall asleep each night to the gentle sounds of the forest, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. Then came the fourth night. I'd had a simple dinner of dehydrated chili and was reading by flashlight in my tent when I dozed off around 10. I woke suddenly at what my watch said was 12:17. Something had pulled me from sleep. Not a sound exactly, but a feeling. You know that sensation when someone's watching you? It was like that, but amplified. I lay perfectly still, listening. The usual forest sounds had gone quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just thick, heavy silence. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the light scurrying of a raccoon or fox, but heavy, deliberate steps that made the ground vibrate slightly beneath my sleeping bag. Something big was walking around my campsite. My first thought was bear, but the footfalls didn't sound right. Bears have this shuffling gait. This was different, more like a person walking, but heavier, with a longer stride. Each step was distinct. Plant, shift weight, plant again. The footsteps circled my tent slowly, methodically. I could track the movement by sound, and whatever it was circling clockwise, about 15 feet out from my tent. Then it stopped, directly in front of the tent entrance. That's when I heard the breathing. Deep, controlled breaths that slightly whistled on the exhale, not labored or aggressive, just the sound of something large pulling air into substantial lungs and releasing it. The breaths were slow, maybe 5 or 6 seconds apart. I've never been more still in my life. I was barely breathing myself, trying to process what was happening. My flashlight was off. The only light was the faint moonlight filtering through the tent fabric, casting everything in a dim blue glow. The breathing continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute. Then the footsteps started again, continuing their circle. When whatever it was reached the back of my tent, I heard a new sound, something being picked up off the ground. The next noise nearly made me jump out of my skin. A massive thud as something heavy hit a tree trunk maybe 30 feet away. Then another object being lifted, and another impact, this one hitting the ground with such force I felt the vibration. It was throwing rocks, big ones judging by the sound they made. This pattern continued, walking, stopping, heavy breathing, throwing rocks, for what my watch later told me was 27 minutes, but felt like hours. Sometimes the footsteps would come closer to the tent, close enough that if I'd reached out, I might have touched whatever was on the other side of that thin nylon wall. Other times, it would move farther away, but never left the general area of my campsite. The rock throwing seemed deliberate, not random. It wasn't throwing them at my tent, thankfully, but around it. At trees, into the brush, onto the ground, like it was establishing some kind of perimeter or sending a message. What was most unnerving was the silence otherwise. No growls, no vocalizations, just breathing and movement. It clearly knew I was there. It seemed to be responding to my presence, but it made no attempt to actually harm me or damage my tent. I lay there, Knife clutched in one hand, fat lot of good that would have done, wondering if I should make noise, shine my light, or just continue to play dead. I chose the latter, partly from fear and partly from some instinct that told me drawing attention wasn't smart. Eventually, after one final rock throw that sounded like it landed in the stream with a distant splash, the footsteps receded. I heard them growing fainter, moving west into denser forest. Then nothing. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I lay there, knife still in hand, listening for any sign of the visitor's return until the first grey light of dawn started to filter through the tent fabric. Only when I could clearly see daylight did I finally unzip the tent, slowly, quietly. I poked my head out first, scanning the area. Nothing moved. The forest had returned to normal. Birds were chirping. A squirrel darted up a nearby tree. But my campsite was different. Scattered everywhere were rocks. Not small stones, but substantial rocks, ranging from softball to bowling ball size. Some were half embedded in the dirt from the force of impact. One had split a fallen log nearly in two. These weren't rocks I'd seen before. They weren't part of the natural terrain in my little clearing. My hands shaking, I pulled on my boots and stepped fully outside. That's when I saw them. The prints. They were footprints, unmistakably so, with 5 toes, a ball, arch and heel clearly defined. But they were enormous, easily 17 inches long and incredibly wide across the ball of the foot. The stride between them was close to 4 feet. They formed a clear circle around my tent, exactly matching the path I'd heard in the night. The prints were pressed deep into the soil. Whatever made them was heavy. I put my boot next to one for scale and felt sick. It was more than twice the length of my size 11 hiking boot. I stood there, staring at those prints, and suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. The forest that had felt so welcoming for 3 days now seemed to be closing in, hiding secrets. I swear I could feel eyes on me, watching from somewhere in the dense trees. It took me less than 20 minutes to break camp. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. I just stuffed everything into my backpack, not caring about organization or proper packing. My hands trembled so badly I struggled with the tent poles. All the while, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line. The forest seemed normal in the morning light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching. The half-mile hike back to the main trail was the longest of my life. I kept hearing sounds behind me, probably just normal forest noises, but each one sent adrenaline surging through my system. I didn't stop moving until I reached my car at the trailhead. And even then, I threw my pack in the back seat and peeled out of there like I was being chased. I've gone over that night thousands of times in my head. I've researched, I've read accounts, I've looked at reports of similar encounters in the area. Everything points to one conclusion, though I still have trouble saying it out loud without feeling ridiculous. It was a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Whatever you want to call it, I know how that sounds. Before that night, I would have laughed at anyone telling me this story. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw in those footprints. No human could make those. No bear walks like that or throws rocks with such deliberate precision. What haunts me most isn't fear that it might have hurt me, because it clearly could have if that was its intention. What haunts me is the purpose behind the behavior. It wasn't random. It felt like a message, a warning. This is my territory. I know you're here. I'm letting you know I can get to you if I want to. I haven't been camping alone since. I've barely been in the woods at all, to be honest. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear those same heavy footsteps outside my bedroom window, that same deep breathing. My wife says I'm just dreaming, and maybe she's right. But part of me knows better. Something found me that night in the Green Mountains. Something intelligent enough to understand intimidation. Something strong enough to throw rocks that would take me 2 hands to lift. Something that wanted me to know it was there. And the worst part, I think it's still out there. And I think about what would have happened if I'd shined my light outside or called out. Some nights I swear I can still feel the ground vibrating with those footsteps, still hear that deep, patient breathing just outside the walls. Story 18. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family and my best friend Mark. Even now, 44 years later, typing this makes my hands shake a bit. I'm 58 years old, but that day in 1979 is burned into my memory like it happened yesterday. It was October 18th, a Thursday. I remember because we had a half day at school for teacher conferences, and Mark had come over to hang out. I was 14, gangly and awkward like most teenage boys. We lived in Calhoun County, Michigan, in a small house that backed up to about 80 acres of woods. Those woods were our playground. We knew every trail, creek and clearing in there, or at least we thought we did. That fall had been unseasonably warm, and the leaves were just starting to change. My mom had made us sandwiches before heading to work, telling us to be back before dark. Standard mom stuff. Mark and I wolfed them down and headed out with our backpacks. We'd been working on a fort about a quarter-mile in. Nothing fancy, just some fallen logs arranged in a square with a tarp we'd borrowed from my dad's garage. "Let's go check out that old apple orchard today," I said between bites. There was an abandoned orchard deeper in the woods, maybe half a mile past our usual spots. We'd only been there once or twice before. Mark nodded, his mouth full. "I bet the apples are ripe now." So we set off, taking the worn path behind my house that disappeared into the trees. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. It was the kind of perfect fall day that makes you glad to be alive. We were talking about normal 14-year-old stuff, the upcoming Halloween dance, whether Melissa Jenkins liked me or not. She didn't. And the latest Atari games. We passed our fort and kept going, following the creek that ran through the property. The further we went, the less familiar things became. The trees grew thicker, older. I remember checking my watch. It was around 2:30 in the afternoon when we reached the orchard. It wasn't much to look at, really. Maybe 20 old apple trees in uneven rows, gnarled and twisted with age. Most of the apples had already fallen and were rotting on the ground, filling the air with a sweet, slightly fermented smell. We each grabbed one of the few good ones left on the lower branches and sat down on a fallen log to rest. That's when I noticed it. The silence. I've been in woods my whole life. They're never silent. There's always something. Birds chirping, squirrels chattering, leaves rustling. But at that moment, everything just stopped. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just this heavy, pressing silence that made the hair on my arms stand up. I looked at Mark, and he must have felt it too because he'd stopped mid-bite, his apple held in front of his mouth. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He shook his head. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly." A light breeze picked up, making the branches sway slightly, but it only emphasized the unnatural quiet. I remember thinking maybe a storm was coming, though the sky was clear through the gaps in the trees. Then we heard it, a loud, deliberate thumping crunch about 50 feet away toward the densest part of the orchard. Like something extremely heavy was stomping on the ground. Thump, crunch, thump, crunch. My blood went cold. I'd grown up around deer, raccoons, even the occasional black bear. None of them moved like that, with such weight and purpose. We both turned toward the sound. That's when I saw it. Among the trees, partially obscured by undergrowth, was something massive, standing upright, covered in hair. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that. It was shaped like a person, but wrong. Too big, way too big. For a split second, it didn't move. Then it did, quickly turning away from us and moving into the denser brush. As it moved, it made this sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, a deep-throated noise that seemed to come from its chest. I can still hear it in my nightmares. I couldn't see its face, thank God, but I saw its back about 3/4 of the way up, what I guess was its stomach, its rear end, and its left leg as it disappeared into the thicket. That leg alone was as tall as I was, and I was about 5'4" at the time. The fur was dark reddish mixed with grey patches, maybe 3 or 4 inches long and incredibly thick. The leg itself was thicker than my entire body. I didn't consciously decide to run. My body just did it. Mark was right beside me. We sprinted through those woods like our lives depended on it, because we were both sure they did. Branches whipped at our faces. I lost my backpack somewhere along the way when it caught on a low branch. But I didn't stop to get it. I didn't even look back. I just ran. My house was about 350 feet from the edge of the woods. I know because my dad measured it once when he was thinking about clearing some trees. That day, it felt like miles. My lungs were burning, my legs were jelly, but the absolute terror pushing me forward was stronger than any exhaustion. We burst out of the tree line and didn't stop until we were inside my house. Door locked behind us. We collapsed on the kitchen floor, gasping for breath. My mum's cat, Molly, arched her back and hissed at us before running upstairs. Even she seemed to sense something was wrong. What the hell was that? Mark panted, his face ghost white. I couldn't answer. I didn't have words. We sat there on the linoleum trying to catch our breath, jumping at every sound outside. Eventually, Mark called his mom to come pick him up. Neither of us wanted to talk about what we'd seen. It felt like saying it out loud would make it more real. After Mark left, I locked all the doors and windows and sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the edge of the woods until my parents came home. I told them I wasn't feeling well and went to bed early. I didn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows had me rigid with fear. The next day at school, Mark and I agreed not to tell anyone. Who would believe us? But we also silently agreed to stay out of the deep woods from then on. Our fort sat abandoned. My backpack stayed lost. I couldn't even bring myself to go back for it. For weeks afterward, I'd hear strange noises at night, screams that didn't sound quite like an owl or any animal I knew. At the time, I tried to convince myself it was just owls. Now I know better. A month later, I finally worked up the courage to walk to the edge of the woods behind our house in broad daylight. I noticed things I hadn't before. Some of the smaller trees were broken at heights no deer or normal animal could reach. There were areas where the ground had unusual depressions, like something incredibly heavy had walked there. I never went back to that apple orchard. My family moved away from Michigan 2 years later, and honestly, I was relieved. I tried to forget about it, to convince myself it had been a bear or my teenage imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew. Fast forward 23 years, I was back in Michigan for a work conference and met up with Mark for a beer. We hadn't seen each other in over a decade. We caught up on our lives, his marriage, my divorce, our kids, our jobs. Then there was a lull in the conversation, and he looked at me with this serious expression. "I still think about that day sometimes," he said quietly. "In the woods." My stomach dropped. We hadn't mentioned it since we were teenagers. "Me too," I admitted. "I've never run that fast in my life," he said. "Not before, not since." Same. We sat in silence for a moment, both remembering. "What do you think it was?" he finally asked. I took a long pull of my beer before answering. "You know what it was." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do." We didn't need to say the word. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name you want to give it, we both knew what we'd seen. I've spent years researching similar encounters since then. There are more than you'd think. People who've had experiences just like ours in those Michigan woods and all across the country. Most don't talk about it publicly. The ridicule isn't worth it. But here's what I know for certain. Something was in those woods that day. Something that shouldn't exist according to science. Something that made the entire forest go silent with its presence. Something massive enough to snap trees and leave footprints that could swallow my teenage foot with room to spare. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just telling you what happened, what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. I'm 58 years old now. I've been through college, marriage, fatherhood, divorce. I've seen a lot in my life, but nothing has ever terrified me like those few seconds in the apple orchard. I still live in a wooded area, ironically. Different state, different woods, but I never go hiking alone. I never stay out past dusk. And whenever the forest around my house goes suddenly unnaturally quiet, I go inside. I lock the doors, and I wait for the sounds to return. Because once you've felt that silence, the silence that comes when everything in nature is holding its breath because something is out there, you never forget it, and you never ever want to hear what comes after.